Chapter 66 of Phineas Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mary Rhodey. Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 66 Victrix. Mr. Monk's holiday program allowed him a week at Killaloe, and from thence he was to go to Limerick, and from Limerick to Dublin, in order that, at both places, he might be entertained at a public dinner and make a speech about tenant right. Foreseeing that Phineas might commit himself if he attended these meetings, Mr. Monk had counselled him to remain at Killaloe, but Phineas had refused to subject himself to such cautious abstinence. Mr. Monk had come to Ireland as his friend, and he would see him through his travels. "I shall not probably be asked to speak," said Phineas, "and if I am asked, I need not say more than a few words. And what if I did speak out?" "You might find it disadvantageous to you in London." "I must take my chance of that. I am not going to tie myself down for ever and ever for the sake of being Under-Secretary to the Colonies." Mr. Monk said very much to him on the subject, was constantly saying very much to him about it. But in spite of all that Mr. Monk said, Phineas did make the journey to Limerick and Dublin. He had not, since his arrival at Killaloe, been a moment alone with Mary Flood Jones, till the evening before he started with Mr. Monk. She had kept out of his way successfully, though she had constantly been with him in company, and was beginning to plume herself on the strength and valour of her conduct. But her self-praise had in it nothing of joy, and her glory was very sad. Of course she would care for him no more especially as it was so very evident that he cared not at all for her. But the very fact of her keeping out of his way made her acknowledge to herself that her position was very miserable. She had declared to her mother that she might certainly go to Killaloe with safety, that it would be better for her to put herself in the way of meeting him as an old friend, that the idea of the necessity of shutting herself up because of his approach was the one thing that gave her real pain. Therefore her mother had brought her to Killaloe, and she had met him. But her fancied security had deserted her, and she found herself to be miserable, hoping for something she did not know what, still dreaming of possibilities, feeling during every moment of his presence with her that some special conduct was necessary on her part. She could not make further confession to her mother, and ask to be carried back to Floodborough, but she knew that she was very wretched at Killaloe. As for Phineas, he had felt that his old friend was very cold to him. He was in that humour with reference to Violet Effingham which seemed especially to require consolation. He knew now that all hope was over there. Violet Effingham could never be his wife. Even were she not to marry Lord Chiltern for the next 5 years, she would not, during those 5 years, marry any other man. Such was our hero's conviction, and suffering under this conviction, he was in want of the comfort of feminine sympathy. Had Mary known all this, and had it suited her to play such a part, I think she might have had Phineas at her feet before he had been a week at home. But she had kept aloof from him, and had heard nothing of his sorrows. As a natural consequence of this, Phineas was more in love with her than ever. On the evening before he started with Mr. Monk for Limerick, he managed to be alone with her for a few minutes. Barbara may probably have assisted in bringing about this arrangement, and had perhaps been guilty of some treachery. Sisters in such circumstances will sometimes be very treacherous to their friends. I feel sure, however, that Mary herself was quite innocent of any guile in the matter. "Mary," Phineas said to her suddenly, "it seems to me that you have avoided me purposely ever since I have been at home." She smiled and blushed and stammered and said nothing. "Has there been any reason for it, Mary?" "No reason at all that I know of," she said. "We used to be such great friends." "That was before you were a great man, Phineas. It must necessarily be different now. You know so many people now, and people of such a different sort, that of course I fall a little into the background." "When you talk in that way, Mary, I know that you are laughing at me." Indeed I am not." "I believe there is no one in the whole world," he said, after a pause, "whose friendship is more to me than yours is. I think of it so often, Mary. Say that when we come back it shall be between us as it used to be." Then he put out his hand for hers, and she could not help giving it to him. "Of course there will be people," he said, "who talk nonsense, and one cannot help it. But I will not put up with it from you." "I did not mean to talk nonsense, Phineas." Then there came someone across them, and the conversation was ended, and she could not help but remember that he had declared that her friendship was dearer to him than the friendship of any one else. Phineas went with Mr. Monk first to Limerick and then to Dublin, and found himself at both places to be regarded as a hero only second to the great hero. At both places the one subject of debate was tenant right. Could anything be done to make it profitable for men with capital to put their capital into Irish land? The fertility of the soil was questioned by no one, nor the sufficiency of external circumstances, such as railroads and the like, nor the abundance of labour, nor even security for the wealth to be produced. The only difficulty was in this, that the men who were to produce the wealth had no guarantee that it would be theirs when it was created. In England and elsewhere such guarantees were in existence. Might it not be possible to introduce them into Ireland? That was the question which Mr. Monk had in hand, and in various speeches which he made both before and after the dinners given to him, he pledged himself to keep it well in hand when Parliament should meet. Of course Phineas spoke also. It was impossible that he should be silent when his friend and leader was pouring out his eloquence. Of course he spoke, and of course he pledged himself. Something like the old pleasures of the debating society returned to him, as standing upon a platform before a listening multitude, he gave full vent to his words. In the House of Commons, of late, he had been so cabined, cribbed, and confined by office as to have enjoyed nothing of this. Indeed, from the commencement of his career, he had fallen so thoroughly into the decorum of government ways as to have missed altogether the delights of that wild, irresponsible oratory of which Mr. Monk had spoken to him so often. He had envied men below the gangway, who, though supporting the government on main questions, could get up on their legs whenever the House was full enough to make it worth their while, and say almost whatever they pleased. There was that Mr. Robson, who literally did say just what came uppermost, and the thing that came uppermost was often ill-natured, often unbecoming the gravity of the House, was always startling. But men listened to him and liked him to speak. But Mr. Robson had married a woman with money. Oh, why had not Violet Effingham been kinder to him? He might even yet, perhaps, marry a woman with money, but he could not bring himself to do so unless he loved her. The upshot of the Dublin meeting was that he also positively pledged himself to support, during the next session of Parliament, a bill advocating tenant right. "I am sorry you went so far as that," Mr. Monk said to him almost as soon as the meeting was over. They were standing on the pier at Kingstown, and Mr. Monk was preparing to return to England. "And why not I as far as you?" "Because I have thought about it, and I do not think that you have. I am prepared to resign my office tomorrow, and directly that I can see Mr. Gresham and explain to him what I have done, I shall offer to do so." "He won't accept your resignation." "He must accept it unless he is prepared to instruct the Irish Secretary to bring in such a bill as I can support." "I shall be exactly in the same boat." "But you ought not to be in the same boat, nor need you. My advice to you is to say nothing about it till you get back to London, and then speak to Lord Cantrip. Tell him that you will not say anything on the subject in the House, but that in the event of there being a division, you hope to be allowed to vote as on an open question. It may be that I shall get Gresham's assent, and if so, we shall be all right. If I do not, and if they choose to make it a point with you, you must resign also." "Of course I shall," said Phineas. "But I do not think they will. You have been too useful, and they will wish to avoid the weakness which comes to a ministry from changing its team. Good-bye, my dear fellow, and remember this. My last word of advice to you is to stick by the ship. I am quite sure it is a career which will suit you. I did not begin it soon enough." Phineas was rather melancholy as he returned alone to Killaloe. It was all very well to bid him stick to the ship, and he knew as well as anyone could tell him how material the ship was to him. But there are circumstances in which a man cannot stick to the ship, cannot stick, at least, to this special government ship. He knew that whither Mr. Monk went in this session he must follow. He had considerable hope that when Mr. Monk explained his purpose to the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister would feel himself obliged to give way. In that case Phineas would not only be able to keep his office, but would have such an opportunity of making a speech in Parliament as circumstances had never yet given to him. When he was again at home, he said nothing to his father or to the Killaloeans as to the danger of his position. Of what use would it be to make his mother and sisters miserable, or to incur the useless counsels of the doctor? They seemed to think his speech at Dublin very fine, and were never tired of talking of what Mr. Monk and Phineas were going to do. But the idea had not come home to them that if Mr. Monk or Phineas chose to do anything on their own account, they must give up the places which they held under the Crown. It was September when Phineas found himself back at Killaloe, and he was due to be at his office in London in November. The excitement of Mr. Monk's company was now over, and he had nothing to do but to receive pouches full of official papers from the Colonial Office, and study all the statistics which came within his reach in reference to the proposed new law for tenant right. In the meantime Mary was still living with her mother at Killaloe, and still kept herself somewhat aloof from the man she loved. How could it be possible for him not to give way in such circumstances as those? One day he found himself talking to her about himself, and speaking to her of his own position with more frankness than he ever used with his own family. He had begun by reminding her of that conversation which they had had before he went away with Mr. Monk, and by reminding her also that she had promised to return to her old friendly ways with him. "Nay, Phineas, there was no promise," she said. "And are we not to be friends?" "I only said that I made no particular promise. Of course we are friends. We have always been friends." "What would you say if you heard that I had resigned my office and given up my seat?" he asked. Of course she expressed her surprise, almost her horror at such an idea, and then he told her everything. It took long in the telling, because it was necessary that he should explain to her the working of the system which made it impossible for him, as a member of the government, to entertain an opinion of his own. "And do you mean that you would lose your salary?" she asked. "Certainly I should." "Would that not be very dreadful?" He laughed as he acknowledged that it would be dreadful. "It is very dreadful, Mary, to have nothing to eat and drink. But what is a man to do? Would you recommend me to say that black is white?" "I am sure you will never do that." "You see, Mary, it is very nice to be called by a big name and to have a salary, and it is very comfortable to be envied by one's friends and enemies. But there are drawbacks. There is this especial drawback." Then he paused for a moment before he went on. "What especial drawback, Phineas?" "A man cannot do what he pleases with himself. How can a man marry, so circumstanced as I am?" She hesitated for a moment, and then she answered him. "A man may be very happy without marrying, I suppose." He also paused for many moments before he spoke again, and then she made a faint attempt to escape from him. But before she succeeded, he had asked her a question which arrested her. "I wonder if you would listen to me if I were to tell you a history?" Of course she listened, and the history he told her was the tale of his love for Violet Effingham. "And she has money of her own?" Mary asked. "Yes, she is rich. She has a large fortune." "Then, Mr. Finn, you must seek someone else who is equally blessed." "Mary, that is untrue. That is ill-natured. You do not mean that. Say that you do not mean it. You have not believed that I loved Miss Effingham because she was rich." "But you have told me that you could love no one who is not rich." "I have said nothing of the kind. Love is involuntary. It does not often run in a yoke with prudence. I have told you my history as far as it is concerned with Violet Effingham. I did love her very dearly." "Did love her, Mr. Finn?" "Yes, did love her. Is there any inconsistency in ceasing to love when one is not loved? Is there inconsistency in changing one's love, and in loving again?" "I do not know," said Mary, to whom the occasion was becoming so embarrassing that she no longer was able to reply with words that had a meaning in them. "If there be, dear, I am inconsistent." He paused, but of course she had not a syllable to say. "I have changed my love, but I could not speak of a new passion till I had told the story of that which has passed away. You have heard it all now, Mary. Can you try to love me after that?" It had come at last, the thing for which she had been ever wishing. It had come in spite of her imprudence, and in spite of her prudence. When she had heard him to the end, she was not a whit angry with him. She was not in the least aggrieved, because he had been lost to her in his love for this Miss Effingham, while she had been so nearly lost by her love for him. For women, such episodes in the lives of their lovers have an excitement which is almost pleasurable, whereas each man is anxious to hear his lady swear that until he appeared upon the scene her heart had been fancy-free. Mary, upon the whole, had liked the story, had thought that it had been finely told, and was well pleased with the final catastrophe. But, nevertheless, she was not prepared with her own reply. "Have you no answer to give me, Mary?" he said, looking up into her eyes. I am afraid that he did not doubt what would be her answer, as it would be good that all lovers should do. "You must vouchsafe me some word, Mary." When she essayed to speak, she found that she was dumb. She could not get her voice to give her the assistance of a single word. She did not cry, but there was a motion as of sobbing in her throat which impeded all utterance. She was as happy as earth, as heaven could make her. but she did not know how to tell him that she was happy, and yet she longed to tell it, that he might know how thankful she was to him for his goodness. He still sat looking at her, and now by degrees he had got her hand in his. "Mary," he said, "will you be my wife, my own wife?" When half an hour had passed, they were still together, and now she had found the use of her tongue. "Do whatever you like best," she said. "I do not care which you do. If you came to me tomorrow, and told me you had no income, it would make no difference, though to love you, and to have your love, is all the world to me, though it makes all the difference between misery and happiness. I would sooner give up that than to be a clog on you." Then he took her in his arms and kissed her. "Oh, Phineas," she said, "I do love you so entirely." "My own one." "Yes, your own one. But if you had known it always. Never mind, now you are my own, are you not?" "Indeed, yes, dearest." "Oh, what a thing it is to be victorious at last!" "What on earth are you two doing here these 2 hours together?" said Barbara, bursting into the room. "What are we doing?" said Phineas. "Yes, what are you doing?" "Nothing in particular," said Mary. "Nothing at all in particular," said Phineas. "Only this, that we have engaged ourselves to marry each other. It is quite a trifle, is it not, Mary?" "Oh, Barbara," said the joyful girl, springing forward into her friend's arms, "I do believe I am the happiest creature on the face of this earth." Chapter 66.
Chapter 67 of Phineas Finn, the Irish Member. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Phineas Finn, the Irish Member, by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 67. Job's Comforters. Before Phineas had returned to London, his engagement with Mary Flood Jones was known to all his family, was known to Mrs. Flood Jones, and was indeed known generally to all Killaloe. That other secret of his, which had reference to the probability of his being obliged to throw up his office, was known only to Mary herself. He thought that he had done all that honour required of him in telling her of his position before he had proposed, so that she might on that ground refuse him if she were so minded. And yet he had known very well that such prudence on her part was not to be expected. If she loved him, of course she would say so when she was asked. And he had known that she loved him. "There may be delay, Mary," he said to her as he was going. "Nay, there must be delay, if I am obliged to resign." "I do not care a straw for delay, if you will be true to me," she said. "Do you doubt my truth, dearest?" "Not in the least. I will swear by it as the one thing that is truest in the world." "You may, dearest." "And if this should come to pass, I must go to work and put my shoulder to the wheel and earn an income for you by my old profession before I can make you my wife. With such a motive before me, I know that I shall earn an income." And thus they parted. Mary, though of course she would have preferred that her future husband should remain in his high office, that he should be a member of Parliament and an Under-Secretary of State, admitted no doubt into her mind to disturb her happiness. And Phineas, though he had many misgivings as to the prudence of what he had done, was not the less strong in his resolution of constancy and endurance. He would throw up his position, resign his seat, and go to work at the bar instantly, if he found that his independence as a man required him to do so. And above all, let come what might, he would be true to Mary Flood Jones. December was half over before he saw Lord Cantrip. "Yes, yes," said Lord Cantrip, when the Under-Secretary began to tell his story. "I saw what you were about. I wish I had been at your elbow." "If you knew the country as I know it, you would be as eager about it as I am." "Then I can only say that I am very glad that I do not know the country as you know it. You see, Finn, it's my idea that if a man wants to make himself useful, he should stick to some special kind of work. With you, it's 1,000 pities that you should not do so." "You think, then, I ought to resign?" "I don't say anything about that. As you wish it, of course I'll speak to Gresham. Monk, I believe, has resigned already." "He has written to me, and told me so," said Phineas. "I always felt afraid of him for your sake, Finn. Mr. Monk is a clever man, and as honest a man as any in the house, but I always thought that he was a dangerous friend for you. However, we will see. I will speak to Gresham after Christmas. There's no hurry about it." When Parliament met, the first great subject of interest was the desertion of Mr. Monk from the ministry. He at once took his place below the gangway, sitting as it happened exactly in front of Mr. Turnbull, and there he made his explanation. Some one opposite asked a question whether a certain right honourable gentleman had not left the cabinet. Then Mr. Gresham replied that to his infinite regret his right honourable friend, who lately presided at the Board of Trade, had resigned, and he went on to explain that this resignation had, according to his ideas, been quite unnecessary. His right honourable friend entertained certain ideas about Irish tenant right, as to which he himself and his right honourable friend the Secretary for Ireland could not exactly pledge themselves to be in unison with him. But he had thought that the motion might have rested at any rate over this session. Then Mr. Monk explained, making his first great speech on Irish tenant right. He found himself obliged to advocate some immediate measure for giving security to the Irish farmer, and as he could not do so as a member of the Cabinet, he was forced to resign the honour of that position. He said something also as to the great doubt which had ever weighed on his own mind as to the inexpediency of a man at his time of life submitting himself for the first time to the trammels of office. This called up Mr. Turnbull, who took the opportunity of saying that he now agreed cordially with his old friend for the first time since that old friend had listened to the blandishments of the ministerial seducer, and that he welcomed his old friend back to those independent benches with great satisfaction. In this way the debate was very exciting. Nothing was said which made it then necessary for Phineas to get upon his legs or to declare himself. But he perceived that the time would rapidly come in which he must do so. Mr. Gresham, though he strove to speak with gentle words, was evidently very angry with the late President of the Board of Trade, and, moreover, it was quite clear that a bill would be introduced by Mr. Monk himself, which Mr. Gresham was determined to oppose. If all this came to pass, and there should be a close division, Phineas felt that his fate would be sealed. When he again spoke to Lord Cantrip on the subject, the Secretary of State shrugged his shoulders and shook his head. "I can only advise you," said Lord Cantrip, "to forget all that took place in Ireland. If you will do so, nobody else will remember it." "As if it were possible to forget such things," he said in the letter which he wrote to Mary that night. "Of course I shall go now. If it were not for your sake, I should not in the least regret it." He had been with Madame Goesler frequently in the winter, and had discussed with her so often the question of his official position that she had declared that she was coming at last to understand the mysteries of an English cabinet. "I think you're quite right, my friend," she said, "quite right. What, you ought to be in Parliament and say that this black thing is white, or that this white thing is black, because you like to take your salary? That cannot be honest." Then, when he came to talk to her of money, that he must give up Parliament itself if he gave up his place, she offered to lend him money. "Why should you not treat me as a friend?" she said. when he pointed out to her that there would never come a time in which he could pay such money back, she stamped her foot, and told him that he had better leave her. "You have high principle," she said, "but not principle sufficiently high to understand that this thing could be done between you and me without disgrace to either of us." Then Phineas assured her, with tears in his eyes, that such an arrangement was impossible without disgrace to him. But he whispered to his new friend no word of the engagement with his dear Irish Mary. His Irish life, he would tell himself, was a thing quite apart and separate from his life in England. He said not a word about Mary Flood Jones to any of those with whom he lived in London. Why should he, feeling as he did that it would so soon be necessary that he should disappear from among them? About Miss Effingham he had said much to Madame Goesler. She had asked him whether he had abandoned all hope. "That affair, then, is over," she had said. "Yes, it is all over now." "And she will marry the red-headed, violent lord?" "Heaven knows, I think she will. But she is exactly the girl to remain unmarried if she takes it into her head that the man she likes is in any way unfitted for her." "Does she love this lord?" "Oh, yes, there is no doubt of that." And Phineas, as he made this acknowledgment, seemed to do so without much inward agony of soul. When he had last been in London, he could not speak of Violet and Lord Chiltern together without showing that his misery was almost too much for him. At this time he received some counsel from two friends. One was Laurence Fitzgibbon, and the other was Barrington Erle. Laurence had always been true to him, after a fashion, and had never resented his intrusion at the Colonial Office. "Phineas, me boy," he said, "if all this is true, you're about up a tree." "It is true that I shall support Monk's motion." "Then, me boy, you're up a tree as far as office goes. A place like that never suited me, because, you see, that poker of a young lord expected so much of a man. But you don't mind that kind of thing, and I thought you were as snug as snug." "Troubles will come, you see, Laurence." "Bedad, yes, it's all troubles, I think, sometimes. But you've a way out of all your troubles." "What way?" "Pop the question to Madame Max. The money's all through, you know." "I doubt the money in the least," said Phineas. "And it's my belief she'll take you without a second word. Anyways, try it, Finny, my boy. That's my advice." Phineas so far agreed with his friend Laurence that he thought it possible that Madame Goesler might accept him were he to propose marriage to her. He knew, of course, that that mode of escape from his difficulties was out of the question for him, but he could not explain this to Laurence Fitzgibbon. "I am sorry to hear that you've taken up a bad cause," said Barrington Erle to him. "It is a pity, is it not?" "And the worst of it is that you'll sacrifice yourself and do no good to the cause. I never knew a man break away in this fashion and not feel afterwards that he had done it all for nothing." "But what is a man to do, Barrington? He can't smother his convictions." "Convictions! There is nothing on earth that I am so much afraid of in a young member of Parliament as convictions. There are ever so many rocks against which men get broken. One man can't keep his temper, another can't hold his tongue, a third can't say a word unless he has been priming himself half a session, a fourth is always thinking of himself and wanting more than he can get, a fifth is idle and won't be there when he's wanted, a sixth is always in the way, a seventh lies so that you can never trust him. I've had to do with them all, but a fellow with convictions is the worst of all." "I don't see how a fellow is to help himself," said Phineas. "When a fellow begins to meddle with politics, they will come." "Why can't you grow into them gradually, as your betters and elders have done before you? It ought to be enough for any man, when he begins, to know that he's a Liberal. He understands which side of the House he's to vote, and who is to lead him. What's the meaning of having a leader to a party if it's not that? Do you think that you and Mr. Monk can go and make a government between you? Whatever I think, I'm sure he doesn't. I'm not so sure of that. But look here, Phineas, I don't care two straws about Monk's going. I always thought that Mildmay and the Duke were wrong when they asked him to join. I knew he'd go over the traces, unless, indeed, he took his money and did nothing for it, which is the way with some of those radicals. I look upon him as gone. He has gone. The devil go along with him, as you say in Ireland. But don't you be such a fool as to ruin yourself for a crochet of Monks. It isn't too late yet for you to hold back. To tell you the truth, Gresham has said a word to me about it already. He is most anxious that you should stay. But of course you can't stay and vote against us. Of course I cannot. I look upon you, you know, as in some sort my own child. I've tried to bring other fellows forward who seemed to have something in them, but I've never succeeded as I have with you. You've hit the thing off and have got the ball at your foot. Upon my honour, in the whole course of my experience, I've never known such good fortune as yours. And I shall always remember how it began, Barrington, said Phineas, who was greatly moved by the energy and solicitude of his friend. But for God's sake don't go and destroy it all by such mad perversity as this. They mean to do something next session. Morrison is going to take it up. Sir Walter Morrison was at this time Secretary for Ireland. But of course we can't let a fellow like Monk take the matter into his own hands just when he pleases. I call it damned treachery. Monk is no traitor, Barrington. Men will have their own opinions about that. It's generally understood that when a man is asked to take a seat in the cabinet, he is expected to conform with his colleagues, unless something very special turns up. But I am speaking of you now, and not of Monk. You are not a man of fortune. You cannot afford to make ducks and drakes. You are excellently placed, and you have plenty of time to hark back, if you'll only listen to reason. All that Irish stump balderdash will never be thrown in your teeth by us, if you will just go on as though it had never been uttered. Phineas could only thank his friend for his advice, which was at least disinterested, and was good of its kind, and tell him that he would think of it. He did think of it very much. He almost thought that, were it to do again, he would allow Mr. Monk to go upon his tour alone, and keep himself from the utterance of anything that so good a judge as Earl could call stump balderdash. As he sat in his armchair in his room at the Colonial Office, with dispatch-boxes around him and official papers spread before him, feeling himself to be one of those who in truth managed and governed the affairs of this great nation, feeling also that if he relinquished his post now, he could never regain it, he did wish that he had been a little less in love with independence, a little quieter in his boastings, that no official considerations should ever silence his tongue. But all this was too late now. He knew that his skin was not thick enough to bear the arrows of those archers who would bend their bows against him, if he should now dare to vote against Mr. Monk's motion. His own party might be willing to forgive and forget, but there would be others who would read those reports and would appear in the House with the odious tell-tale newspapers in their hands. Then he received a letter from his father. Some good-natured person had enlightened the doctor as to the danger in which his son was placing himself. Dr. Finn, who in his own profession was a very excellent and well-instructed man, had been so ignorant of parliamentary tactics as to have been proud at his son's success at the Irish meetings. He had thought that Phineas was carrying on his trade as a public speaker with proper energy and continued success. He had cared nothing himself for tenant right, and had acknowledged to Mr. Monk that he could not understand in what it was that the farmers were wronged. But he knew that Mr. Monk was a cabinet minister, and he thought that Phineas was earning his salary. Then there came someone who undeceived him, and the paternal bosom of the doctor was dismayed. "I don't mean to interfere," he said in his letter, "but I can hardly believe that you really intend to resign your place. Yet I am told that you must do so if you go on with this matter. My dear boy, pray think about it. I cannot imagine you are disposed to lose all that you have won for nothing." Mary also wrote to him. Mrs. Finn had been talking to her, and Mary had taught herself to believe that after the many sweet conversations she had had with a man so high in office as Phineas, she really did understand something about the British government. Mrs. Finn had interrogated Mary, and Mary had been obliged to own that it was quite possible that Phineas would be called upon to resign. "But why, my dear? Heaven and earth, resign 2,000 a year?" "That he may maintain his independence," said Mary proudly. "Fiddlestick," said Mrs. Finn. "How is he to maintain you, or himself either, if he goes on in that way? I shouldn't wonder if he didn't get himself all wrong even now." Then Mrs. Finn began to cry, and Mary could only write to her lover, pointing out to him how very anxious all his friends were that he should do nothing in a hurry. But what if the thing were done already? Phineas, in his great discomfort, went to seek further counsel from Madame Goesler. Of all his counsellors, Madame Goesler was the only one who applauded him for what he was about to do. "But, after all, what is it you give up? Mr. Gresham may be out tomorrow, and then where will be your place?" "There does not seem to be much chance of that at present." "Who can tell? Of course, I do not understand. But it was only the other day when Mr. Mildmay was there, and only the day before that when Lord de Terrier was there, and again only the day before that when Lord Brock was there." Phineas endeavoured to make her understand that of the 4 prime ministers whom she had named, 3 were men of the same party as himself, under whom it would have suited him to serve. "I would not serve under any man if I were an English gentleman in Parliament," said Madame Goesler. "What is a poor fellow to do?" said Phineas, laughing. "A poor fellow need not be a poor fellow unless he likes," said Madame Goesler. Immediately after this Phineas left her, and as he went along the street he began to question himself whether the prospects of his own darling Mary were at all endangered by his visits to Park Lane, and to reflect what sort of a blackguard he would be, a blackguard of how deep a dye, were he to desert Mary and marry Madame Max Goesler. Then he also asked himself as to the nature and quality of his own political honesty, if he were to abandon Mary in order that he might maintain his parliamentary independence. After all, if it should come to pass that his biography should be written, his biographer would say very much more about the manner in which he kept his seat in Parliament than of the manner in which he kept his engagement with Miss Mary Flood Jones. Half a dozen people who knew him and her might think ill of him for his conduct to Mary, but the world would not condemn him. And when he thundered forth his liberal eloquence from below the gangway as an independent member, having the fortune of his charming wife to back him, giving excellent dinners at the same time in Park Lane, would not the world praise him very loudly? When he got to his office, he found a note from Lord Brentford inviting him to dine in Portman Square. End of chapter 67. Chapter 68 of Phineas Finn, the Irish Member. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Phineas Finn, the Irish Member, by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 68. The Joint Attack. The note from Lord Brentford surprised our hero not a little. He had no communication with the Earl since the day on which he had been so savagely scolded about the duel, when the Earl had plainly told him that his conduct had been as bad as it could be. Phineas had not on that account become at all ashamed of his conduct in reference to the duel, but he had conceived that any reconciliation between him and the Earl had been out of the question. Now there had come a civilly worded invitation, asking him to dine with the offended nobleman. The note had been written by Lady Laura, but it had purported to come from Lord Brentford himself. He sent back word to say that he would be happy to have the honour of dining with Lord Brentford. Parliament at this time had been sitting nearly a month, and it was already March. Phineas had heard nothing of Lady Laura, and did not even know that she was in London till he saw her handwriting. He did not know that she had not gone back to her husband, and that she had remained with her father all the winter at Salisbury. He had also heard that Lord Chiltern had been at Salisbury. All the world had been talking of the separation of Mr. Kennedy from his wife, one half of the world declaring that his wife, if not absolutely false to him, had neglected all her duties, and the other half asserting that Mr. Kennedy's treatment of his wife had been so bad that no woman could possibly have lived with him. There had even been a rumour that Lady Laura had gone off with a lover from the Duke of Omnium's garden party, and some indiscreet tongue had hinted that a certain unmarried Under-Secretary of State was missing at the same time. But Lord Chiltern, upon this, had shown his teeth with so strong a propensity to do some real biting that no one had ventured to repeat that rumour. Its untruth was soon established by the fact that Lady Laura Kennedy was living with her father at Salisbury. Of Mr. Kennedy, Phineas had as yet seen nothing since he had been up in town. That gentleman, though a member of the Cabinet, had not been in London at the opening of the session, nor had he attended the Cabinet meetings during the recess. It had been stated in the newspapers that he was ill, and stated in private that he could not bear to show himself since his wife had left him. At last, however, he came to London, and Phineas saw him in the house. Then, when the first meeting of the Cabinet was summoned after his return, it became known that he also had resigned his office. There was nothing said about his resignation in the House. He had resigned on the score of ill health, and that very worthy peer, Lord Mount Thistle, formerly Sir Marmaduke Morecambe, came back to the Duchy of Lancaster in his place. A Prime Minister sometimes finds great relief in the possession of a serviceable stick, who can be made to go in and out as occasion may require. Only it generally happens that the stick will expect some reward when he is made to go out. Lord Mount Thistle immediately saw his way to a viscount's coronet, when he was once more summoned to the august councils of the ministers. A few days after this had been arranged, in the interval between Lord Brentford's invitation and Lord Brentford's dinner, Phineas encountered Mr. Kennedy so closely in one of the passages of the house that it was impossible that they should not speak to each other, unless they were to avoid each other as people do who have palpably quarrelled. Phineas saw that Mr. Kennedy was hesitating, and therefore took the bull by the horns. He greeted his former friend in a friendly fashion, shaking him by the hand, and then prepared to pass on. But Mr. Kennedy, though he had hesitated at first, now detained his brother member. "Finn," he said, "if you are not engaged, I should like to speak to you for a moment." Phineas was not engaged, and allowed himself to be led out, arm in arm, by the late Chancellor of the Duchy, into Westminster Hall. "Of course, you know what a terrible thing has happened to me," said Mr. Kennedy. "Yes, I have heard of it," said Phineas. "Everybody has heard of it. That is one of the terrible cruelties of such a blow." "All those things are very bad, of course. I was very much grieved, because you have both been intimate friends of mine." "Yes, yes, we were." "Do you ever see her now?" "Not since last July, at the Duke's party, you know." "Ah, yes. The morning of that day was the last on which I spoke to her. It was then she left me." "I am going to dine with Lord Brentford tomorrow, and I dare say she will be there." "Yes, she is in town. I saw her yesterday in her father's carriage. I think that she had no cause to leave me." "Of course I cannot say anything about that." "I think she had no cause to leave me," Phineas, as he heard this, could not but remember all that Lady Laura had told himself, and thought that no woman had ever had a better reason for leaving her husband. "There were things I did not like, and I said so." "I suppose that is generally the way," replied Phineas. "But surely a wife should listen to a word of caution from her husband." "I fancy they never like it," said Phineas. "But are we all of us to have all that we like? I have not found it so. Or would it be good for us if we had?" Then he paused. But as Phineas had no further remark to make, he continued speaking after they had walked about a third of the length of the hall. "It is not of my own comfort I am thinking now so much as of her name and her future conduct. Of course it will be in every sense be best for her that she should come back to her husband's roof." "Well, yes, perhaps it would," said Phineas. "Has she not accepted that lot for better or for worse?" said Mr. Kennedy solemnly. "But incompatibility of temper, you know, is always supposed. You understand me?" "It is my intention that she should come back to me. I do not wish to make any legal demand, at any rate not as yet. Will you consent to be the bearer of a message from me both to herself and to the Earl?" Now it seemed to Phineas that of all the messengers whom Mr. Kennedy could have chosen, he was the most unsuited to be a Mercury in this cause, not perceiving that he had been so selected with some craft, in order that Lady Laura might understand that the accusation against her was, at any rate, withdrawn, which had named Phineas as her lover. He paused again before he answered. "Of course," he said, "I should be most willing to be of service, if it were possible, but I do not see how I can speak to the Earl about it. Though I am going to dine with him, I don't know why he's asked me, for he and I are on very bad terms. He heard that stupid story about the duel, and has not spoken to me since." "I heard that too," said Mr. Kennedy, frowning blackly as he remembered his wife's duplicity. "Everybody heard of it, but it has made such a difference between him and me that I don't think I can meddle. Send for Lord Chiltern and speak to him." "Speak to Chiltern? Never. He would probably strike me on the head with his club." "Call on the Earl yourself." "I did, and he would not see me." "Write to him." "I did, and he sent back my letter unopened." "Write to her." "I did, and she answered me saying only thus: 'Indeed, indeed, it cannot be so.'" "But it must be so. The laws of God require it, and the laws of man permit it. I want someone to point out that to them more softly than I could do if I were simply to write to that effect. To the Earl, of course, I cannot write again." The conference ended by a promise from Phineas that he would, if possible, say a word to Lady Laura. When he was shown into Lord Brentford's drawing-room, he found not only Lady Laura there, but her brother. Lord Brentford was not in the room. Barrington Erle was there, and so also were Lord and Lady Cantrip. "Is not your father going to be here?" he said to Lady Laura after their first greeting. "We live in that hope," she said, "and do not at all know why he should be late. What has become of him, Oswald?" "He came in with me half an hour ago, and I suppose he does not dress as quickly as I do," said Lord Chiltern, upon which Phineas immediately understood that the father and the son were reconciled, and he rushed to the conclusion that Violet and her lover would also soon be reconciled, if such were not already the case. He felt some remnant of a soreness that it should be so, as a man feels where his headache has been when the real ache itself has left him. Then the host came in and made his apologies. "Chiltern kept me standing about," he said, "till the east wind had chilled me through and through. The only charm I recognize in youth is that it is impervious to the east wind." Phineas felt quite sure now that Violet and her lover were reconciled, and he had a distinct feeling of the place where the ache had been. Dear Violet! But after all, Violet lacked that sweet, clinging, feminine softness which made Mary Flood-Jones so preeminently the most charming of her sex. The Earl, when he had repeated his general apology, especially to Lady Cantrip, who was the only lady present except his daughter, came up to our hero and shook him kindly by the hand. He took him up to one of the windows and then addressed him in a voice of mock solemnity. "Stick to the colonies, young man," he said, "and never meddle with foreign affairs, especially not at Blankenberg." "Never again, my lord, never again." "And leave all questions of firearms to be arranged between the Horse Guards and the War Office. I have heard a good deal about it since I saw you, and I retract a part of what I said. But a duel is a foolish thing, a very foolish thing. Come, here is dinner." And the Earl walked off with Lady Cantrip, and Lord Cantrip walked off with Lady Laura. Barrington Erle followed, and Phineas had an opportunity of saying a word to his friend Lord Chiltern as they went down together. "It's all right between you and your father?" "Yes, after a fashion. There's no knowing how long it will last. He wants me to do 3 things, and I won't do any one of them." "What of the 3? "To go into Parliament, to be an owner of sheep and oxen, and to hunt in his own county. I should never attend the first, I should ruin myself with the second, and I should never get a run in the third." But there was not a word said about his marriage. There were only 7 who sat down to dinner, and the 6 were all people with whom Phineas was or had been on most intimate terms. Lord Cantrip was his official chief, and, since that connection had existed between them, Lady Cantrip had been very gracious to him. She quite understood the comfort which it was to her husband to have under him, as his representative in the House of Commons, a man whom he could thoroughly trust and like, and therefore she had used her woman's arts to bind Phineas to her lord in more than mere official bondage. She had tried her skill also upon Laurence Fitzgibbon, but altogether in vain. He had eaten her dinners and accepted her courtesies, and had given for them no return whatever. But Phineas had possessed a more grateful mind, and had done all that had been required of him, till there had come that terrible absurdity in Ireland. "I knew very well what sort of things would happen when they brought such a man as Mr. Monk into the cabinet," Lady Cantrip had said to her husband. But though the party was very small, and though the guests were all his intimate friends, Phineas suspected nothing special, till an attack was made upon him as soon as the servants had left the room. This was done in the presence of the 2 ladies, and, no doubt, had been preconcerted. There was Lord Cantrip there, who had already said much to him, and Barrington Erle, who had said more even than Lord Cantrip. Lord Brentford himself, as a member of the Cabinet, opened the attack by asking whether it was actually true that Mr. Monk meant to go on with his motion. Barrington Erle asserted that Mr. Monk positively would do so. "And Gresham will oppose it?" asked the Earl. "Of course he will," said Barrington. "Of course he will," said Lord Cantrip. "I know what I should think of him if he did not," said Lady Cantrip. "He is the last man in the world to be forced into a thing," said Lady Laura. Then Phineas knew pretty well what was coming on him. Lord Brentford began again by asking how many supporters Mr. Monk would have in the House. "Oh, that depends upon the amount of courage which the Conservatives may have," said Barrington Erle. "If they dare to vote for a thoroughly democratic measure, simply for the sake of turning us out, it is quite on the cards that they may succeed." "But of our own people?" asked Lord Cantrip. "You had better inquire that of Phineas Finn," said Barrington. And then the attack was made. Our hero had a bad half-hour of it. Though many words were said which must have gratified him much, they all wanted to keep him, so Lord Cantrip declared. "Except 1 or 2 whom I could name, and who are particularly anxious to wear his shoes," said Barrington, thinking that certain reminiscences of Phineas with regard to Mr. Bonteen and others might operate as strongly as any other consideration to make him love his place. Lord Brentford declared that he could not understand it, that he should find himself lost in amazement if such a man as his young friend allowed himself to be led into the outer wilderness by such an ignis fatuus of light as this. Lord Cantrip laid down the unwritten traditional law of government officials very plainly. A man in an office which really imposed upon him as much work as he could possibly do with credit to himself or his cause, was dispensed from the necessity of a conscience with reference to other matters. It was for Sir Walter Morrison to have a conscience about Irish tenant right, as no doubt he had, just as Phineas Finn had a conscience about Canada and Jamaica and the Cape. Barrington Erle was very strong about parties in general, and painted the comforts of official position in glowing colours, but I think that the two ladies were more efficacious than even their male relatives in the arguments which they used. "We have been so happy to have you among us," said Lady Cantrip, looking at him with beseeching, almost loving eyes. "Mr. Finn knows," said Lady Laura, "that since he first came into Parliament I have always believed in his success, and I have been very proud to see it." "We shall weep over him as over a fallen angel if he leaves us," said Lady Cantrip. "I won't say that I will weep," said Lady Laura, "but I do not know anything of the kind that would so truly make me unhappy." What was he to say in answer to applications so flattering and so pressing? He would have said nothing had that been possible, but he felt himself obliged to reply. He replied very weakly, of course not justifying himself, but declaring that as he had gone so far he must go further. He must vote for the measure now. Both his chief and Barrington Erle proved, or attempted to prove, that he was wrong in this. Of course he would not speak on the measure, and his vote for his party would probably be allowed to pass without notice. One or two newspapers might perhaps attack him, but what public man cared for such attacks as those? His whole party would hang by him, and in that he would find ample consolation. Phineas could only say that he would think of it, and this he said in so irresolute a tone of voice that all the men then present believed that he was gained. The two ladies, however, were of a different opinion. "In spite of anything that anybody may say, he will do what he thinks right when the time comes," said Laura to her father afterwards. But then Lady Laura had been in love with him, was perhaps almost in love with him still. "I am afraid he is a mule," said Lady Cantrip to her husband. "He's a good mule up a hill with a load on his back," said his lordship. "But with the mule there always comes a time when you can't manage him," said Lady Cantrip. But Lady Cantrip had never been in love with Phineas. Phineas found a moment before he left Lord Brentford's house to say a word to Lady Laura as to the commission that had been given to him. "It can never be," said Lady Laura, shuddering. "Never, never, never." "You are not angry with me for speaking?" "Oh, no, not if he told you." "He made me promise that I would." "Tell him it cannot be. Tell him that if he has any instruction to send me as to what he considers to be my duty, I will endeavour to comply, if that duty can be done apart. I will recognize him so far because of my vow, but not even for the sake of my vow will I endeavour to live with him. His presence would kill me." When Phineas repeated this, or as much of this as he judged to be necessary, to Mr. Kennedy, a day or two afterwards, that gentleman replied that in such case he would have no alternative but to seek redress at law. "I have done nothing to my wife," said he, "of which I need be ashamed. It will be sad, no doubt, to have all our affairs bandied about in court, and made the subject of comment in newspapers, but a man must go through that, or worse than that, in the vindication of his rights, and for the performance of his duty to his Maker." That very day Mr. Kennedy went to his lawyer, and desired that steps might be taken for the restitution to him of his conjugal rights. End of chapter 68. Chapter 69 of Phineas Finn, the Irish Member. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Phineas Finn, the Irish Member, by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 69, The Temptress. Mr. Monk's bill was read the first time before Easter, and Phineas Finn still held his office. He had spoken to the Prime Minister once on the subject, and had been surprised at that gentleman's courtesy, for Mr. Gresham had the reputation of being unconciliatory in his manners, and very prone to resent anything like desertion from that allegiance which was due to himself as the leader of his party. "You had better stay where you are, and take no step that may be irretrievable till you have quite made up your mind," said Mr. Gresham. "I fear I have made up my mind," said Phineas. "Nothing can be done till after Easter," replied the great man, "and there is no knowing how things may go then. I strongly recommend you stay with us. If you can do this, it will be only necessary that you shall put your resignation in Lord Cantrip's hands before you speak or vote against us. See Monk, and talk it over with him." Mr. Gresham possibly imagined that Mr. Monk might be moved to abandon his bill when he saw what injury he was about to do. At this time Phineas received the following letter from his darling Mary. Floodborough, Thursday. Dearest Phineas, we have just got home from Killaloe, and mean to remain here all through the summer. After leaving your sisters, this house seems so desolate, but I shall have the more time to think of you. I have been reading Tennyson, as you told me, and I fancy that I could in truth be a Mariana here, if it were not that I am so quite certain that you will come, and that makes all the difference in the world in a moated grange. Last night I sat at the window and tried to realize what I should feel if you were to tell me that you did not want me, and I got myself into such an ecstatic state of mock melancholy that I cried for half an hour. But when one has such a real living joy at the back of one's romantic melancholy, tears are very pleasant. They water and do not burn. I must tell you about them all at Killaloe. They certainly are very unhappy at the idea of your resigning. Your father says very little, but I made him own that to act as you are acting for the sake of principle is very grand. I would not leave him till he had said so, and he did say it. Dear Mrs. Finn does not understand it as well, but she will do so. She complains mostly for my sake, and when I tell her that I will wait 20 years if it is necessary, she tells me I do not know what waiting means. But I will, and will be happy, and will never really think myself a Mariana. Dear, dear, dear Phineas, indeed I won't. The girls are half sad and half proud, but I am wholly proud, and know that you are doing just what you ought to do. I shall think more of you as a man who might have been a Prime Minister than if you were really sitting in the Cabinet like Lord Cantrip. As for Mamma, I cannot make her quite understand it. She merely says that no young man who is going to be married ought to resign anything. Dear Mamma, sometimes she does say such odd things. You told me to tell you everything, and so I have. I talked to some of the people here and tell them what they might do if they had tenant right. One old fellow, Mike Doherty, I don't know whether you remember him, asked if he would have to pay the rent at all the same. When I said certainly he would, then he shook his head. But as you said once, When we want to do good to people, one has no right to expect that they should understand it. It is like baptizing little infants. I got both your notes. 7 words in one, Mr. Under-Secretary, and 9 in the other. But the one little word at the end was worth a whole sheet full of common words. How nice it is to write letters without paying postage, and to send them about the world with a grand name in the corner. When Barney brings me one, he always looks as if he didn't know whether it was a love letter or an order to go to Botany Bay. If he saw the inside of them, how short they are, I don't think he'd think much of you as a lover, nor yet as an Under-Secretary. But I think ever so much of you as both. I do, indeed, and I am not scolding you a bit. As long as I can have 2 or 3 dear, sweet, loving words, I shall be as happy as a queen. Ah, if you knew it all! But you never can know it all. A man has so many other things to learn that he cannot understand it. Goodbye, dear, dear, dearest man. Whatever you do, I shall be quite sure you have done the best. Ever your own, with all the love of her heart, Mary F. Jones.
This was very nice. Such a man as was Phineas Finn always takes a delight, which he cannot express even to himself, in the receipt of such a letter as this. There is nothing so flattering as the warm expression of the confidence of a woman's love, and Phineas thought that no woman ever expressed this more completely than did his Mary. Dear, dearest Mary! As for giving her up, as for treachery to one so trusting, so sweet, so well beloved, that was out of the question. But nevertheless the truth came home to him more clearly day by day, that he of all men was the last who ought to have given himself up to such a passion. For her sake he ought to have abstained. So he told himself now. For her sake he ought to have kept aloof from her, and for his own sake he ought to have kept aloof from Mr. Monk. That very day, with Mary's letter in his pocket, he went to the livery stables and explained that he would not keep his horse any longer. There was no difficulty about the horse. Mr. Howard MacLeod of the Treasury would take him from that very hour. Phineas, as he walked away, uttered a curse upon Mr. Howard MacLeod. Mr. Howard MacLeod was just beginning the glory of his life in London, and he, Phineas Finn, was bringing his to an end. With Mary's letter in his pocket he went up to Portman Square. He had again got into the habit of seeing Lady Laura frequently, and was often with her brother, who now again lived at his father's house. A letter had reached Lord Brentford, through his lawyer, in which a demand was made by Mr. Kennedy for the return of his wife. She was quite determined that she would never go back to him, and there had come to her a doubt whether it would not be expedient that she should live abroad, so as to be out of the way of persecution from her husband. Lord Brentford was in great wrath, and Lord Chiltern had once or twice hinted that perhaps he had better see Mr. Kennedy. The amenities of such an interview as this would be had up to the present day been postponed, and in a certain way Phineas had been used as a messenger between Mr. Kennedy and his wife's family. "I think it will end," she said, "in my going to Dresden and settling myself there. Papa will come to me when Parliament is not sitting." "It will be very dull." "Dull? What does dullness amount to when one has come to such a pass as this? When one is in the ruck of fortune, to be dull is very bad. But when misfortune comes, simple dullness is nothing. It sounds almost like relief." "It is so hard that you should be driven away." She did not answer him for a while, and he was beginning to think of his own case also. Was it not hard that he too should be driven away? "It is odd enough that we should both be going at the same time." "But you will not go?" "I think I shall. I have resolved upon this, that if I give up my place,
I will give up my seat too. I went into Parliament with the hope of office, and how can I remain there when I shall have gained it and then have lost it? But you will stay in London, Mr. Finn? I think not. After all that has come and gone, I should not be happy here, and I should make my way easier and on cheaper terms in Dublin. My present idea is that I shall endeavour to make a practice over in my own country. It will be hard work beginning at the bottom, will it not? And so unnecessary. Ah, Lady Laura, if it only could be avoided, but it is of no use going through all that again. How much we would both of us avoid if we could only have another chance, said Lady Laura. If I could only be as I was before I persuaded myself to marry a man whom I never loved, what a paradise the earth would be to me. With me, all regrets are too late. And with me, as much so. No, Mr. Finn. Even should you resign your office, there is no reason why you should give up your seat. Simply that I have no income to maintain me in London. She was silent for a few moments, during which she changed her seat so as to come nearer to him, placing herself on a corner of a sofa close to the chair on which he was seated. I wonder whether I may speak to you plainly, she said. Indeed you may. On any subject? Yes, on any subject. I trust you have been able to rid your bosom of all remembrances of Violet Effingham? Certainly not of all remembrances, Lady Laura. Of all hope, then? I have no such hope. And of all lingering desires? Well, yes, and of all lingering desires. I know now that it cannot be. Your brother is welcome to her. Ah, of that I know nothing. He, with his perversity, has estranged her, but I am sure of this, that if she do not marry him, she will marry no one. But it is not on account of him that I speak. He must fight his own battles now. I shall not interfere with him, Lady Laura. Then why should you not establish yourself by a marriage that will make place a matter of indifference to you? I know that it is within your power to do so. Phineas put his hand up to his breast-coat pocket, and felt that Mary's letter, her precious letter, was there safe. It certainly was not in his power to do this thing which Lady Laura recommended to him, but he hardly thought that the present was a moment suitable for explaining to her the nature of the impediment which stood in the way of such an arrangement. He had so lately spoken to Lady Laura with an assurance of undying constancy of his love for Miss Effingham, that he could not as yet acknowledge the force of another passion. He shook his head by way of reply. I tell you that it is so, she said with energy. I am afraid not. Go to Madame Goesler and ask her. Hear what she will say. Madame Goesler would laugh at me, no doubt. You do not think so. You know that she would not laugh. And are you the man to be afraid of a woman's laughter? I think not. Again he did not answer her at once, and when he did speak, the tone of his voice was altered. What is it you said of yourself just now? What did I say of myself? You regretted that you had consented to marry a man whom you did not love. Why should you not love her? And it is so different with a man. A woman is wretched if she does not love her husband, but I fancy that a man gets on very well without any such feeling. She cannot domineer over you. She cannot expect you to pluck yourself out of your own soil and begin a new growth altogether in accordance with the laws of her own. It was that which Mr. Kennedy did. I do not for a moment think that she would take me if I were to offer myself. Try her, said Lady Laura energetically. Such trials cost you but little. We both of us know that. Still he said nothing of the letter in his pocket. It is everything that you should go on now that you have once begun. I do not believe in you working at the bar. You cannot do it.
a man who has commenced life as you have done, with the excitement of politics, who has known what it is to take a prominent part in the control of public affairs, cannot give it up and be happy at other work. Make her your wife, and you may resign or remain in office just as you choose. Office will be much easier to you than it is now, because it will not be a necessity. Let me at any rate have the pleasure of thinking that one of us can remain here, that we need not both fall together." Still he did not tell her of the letter in his pocket. He felt that she moved him, that she made him acknowledge to himself how great would be the pity of such a failure as would be his. He was quite as much alive as she could be to the fact that work at the bar, either in London or in Dublin, would have no charms for him now. The prospect of such a life was very dreary to him. Even with the comfort of Mary's love, such a life would be very dreary to him. And then he knew, he thought that he knew, that were he to offer himself to Madame Goesler, he would not in truth be rejected. She had told him that if poverty was a trouble to him, he need be no longer poor. Of course he had understood this. Her money was at his service if he should choose to stoop and pick it up. And it was not only money that such a marriage would give him. He had acknowledged to himself more than once that Madame Goesler was very lovely, that she was clever, attractive in every way, and as far as he could see, blessed with a sweet temper. She had position, too, in the world that would help him rather than mar him. What might he not do with an independent seat in the House of Commons, and as joint owner of the little house in Park Lane? Of all careers which the world could offer to a man, the pleasantest would then be within his reach. "You appear to me as a tempter," he said at last to Lady Laura. "It is unkind of you to say that, and ungrateful. I would do anything on earth in my power to help you. Nevertheless, you are a tempter." "I know how it ought to have been," she said in a low voice. "I know very well how it ought to have been. I should have kept myself free till that time when we met on the braes of Loughlinter, and then all would have been well with us." "I do not know how that might have been," said Phineas hoarsely. "You do not know? But I know. Of course you have stabbed me with 1,000 daggers when you have told me from time to time of your love for Violet. You have been very cruel, needlessly cruel. Men are so cruel. But for all that, I have known that I could have kept you, had it not been too late when you spoke to me. Will you not own as much as that? Of course, you would have been everything to me. I should never have thought of Violet then. That is the only kind word you have said to me from that day to this. I try to comfort myself in thinking that it would have been so, but all that is past and gone and done. I have had my romance, and you have had yours. As you are a man, it is natural that you should have been disturbed by a double image. It is not so with me. And yet you can advise me to offer marriage to a woman whom I am to seek merely because she is rich. Yes, I do so advise you. You have had your romance, and must now put up with reality. Why should I so advise you but for the interest that I have in you? Your prosperity will do me no good. I shall not even be here to see it. I shall hear of it only as so many a woman banished out of England hears a distant, misunderstood report of what is going on in the country she has left. But I still have regard enough. I will be bold, and, knowing that you will not take it amiss, will say love enough for you, to feel a desire that you should not be shipwrecked. Since we first took you in hand between us, Barrington and I have never swerved in my anxiety on your behalf. When I resolved that it would be better for us both that we should be only friends, I did not swerve. When you would talk to me so cruelly of your love for Violet, I did not swerve. When I warned you from Loughlinter because I thought there was danger, I did not swerve. When I bade you not to come to me in London because of my husband,
I did not swerve. When my father was hard upon you, I did not swerve then. I would not leave him till he was softened. When you tried to rob Oswald of his love, and I thought you would succeed, for I did think so, I did not swerve. I have ever been true to you. And now that I must hide myself and go away and be seen no more, I am true still. Laura, dearest Laura, he exclaimed. Ah, no, she said, speaking with no touch of anger, but all in sorrow. It must not be like that. There is no room for that, nor do you mean it. I do not think so ill of you. But there may not be even words of affection between us, only such as I may speak to make you know that I am your friend. You are my friend, he said, stretching out his hand to her as he turned away his face. You are my friend indeed. Then do as I would have you do. He put his hand into his pocket and had the letter between his fingers with the purport of showing it to her. But at the moment the thought occurred to him that were he to do so, then, indeed, he would be bound for ever. He knew that he was bound for ever to his own Mary, but he desired to have the privilege of thinking over such bondage once more before he proclaimed it, even to his dearest friend. He had told her that she tempted him, and she stood before him now as a temptress. But lest it might be possible that she should not tempt in vain, that letter in his pocket must never be shown to her. In that case Lady Laura must never hear from his lips the name of Mary Flood Jones. He left her without any assured purpose, without, that is, the assurance to her of any fixed purpose. There yet wanted a week to the day on which Mr. Monk's bill was to be read, or not to be read, the second time, and he had still that interval before he need decide. He went to his club, and before he dined he strove to write a line to Mary. But when he had the paper before him, he found that it was impossible to do so. Though he did not even suspect himself of an intention to be false, the idea that was in his mind made the effort too much for him. He put the paper away from him and went down and ate his dinner. It was a Saturday, and there was no house in the evening. He had remained in Portman Square with Lady Laura till near 7 o'clock, and was engaged to go out in the evening to a gathering at Mrs. Gresham's house. Everybody in London would be there, and Phineas was resolved that as long as he remained in London he would be seen at places where everybody was seen. He would certainly be at Mrs. Gresham's gathering, but there was an hour or two before he need to go home to dress, and as he had nothing to do, he went down to the smoking-room of his club. The seats were crowded, but there was one vacant, and before he had looked about him to scrutinize his neighbourhood, he found that he had placed himself with Bonteen on his right hand and Rattler on his left. There were no two men in all London whom he more thoroughly disliked, but it was too late for him to avoid them now. They instantly attacked him, first on one side and then on the other. "So, I am told you are going to leave us," said Bonteen. "Who can have been ill-natured enough to whisper such a thing?" replied Phineas. "The whispers are very loud, I can tell you," said Rattler. "I think I know already pretty nearly how every man in the House will vote, but I have not got your name down on the right side." "Change it, for heaven's sake," said Phineas. "I will, if you'll tell me seriously that I may," said Rattler. "My opinion is," said Bonteen, "that a man should be known either as a friend or foe. I respect a declared foe." "Know me as a declared foe, then," said Phineas, "and respect me." "That's all very well," said Rattler, "but it means nothing. I've always had a sort of fear about you, Finn, that you would go over the traces some day. Of course, it's a very grand thing to be independent." "The finest thing in the world," said Bonteen, "only so damned useless." "But a man shouldn't be independent and stick to the ship at the same time.
You forget the trouble you cause, and how you upset all calculations." "I hadn't thought of the calculations," said Phineas. "The fact is, Finn," said Bonteen, "you are made of clay too fine for office. I've always found it has been so with men from your country. You're the grandest horse in the world to look at out on a prairie, but you don't like the slavery of harness. And the sound of a whip over our shoulders sets us kicking, does it not, Rattler?" "I shall show the list to Gresham tomorrow," said Rattler, "and of course he can do as he pleases, but I don't understand this kind of thing." "Don't you be in a hurry," said Bonteen. "I'll bet you a sovereign Finn votes with us yet. There's nothing like being a little coy to set off a girl's charms. I'll bet you a sovereign, Rattler, that Finn goes out into the lobby with you and me against Monk's bill."
Phineas, not being able to stand any more of this most unpleasant raillery, got up and went away. The club was distasteful to him, and he walked off and sauntered for a while about the park. He went down by the Duke of York's column, as though he were going to his office, which of course was closed at this hour, but turned round when he got beyond the new public buildings which he was never destined to use in their completed state, and entered the gates of the enclosure, and wandered on over the bridge across the water. As he went, his mind was full of thought. Could it be good for him to give up everything for a fair face? He swore to himself that of all women whom he had ever seen, Mary was the sweetest, and the dearest, and the best. If it could be well to lose the world for a woman, it would be well to lose it for her. Violet, with all her skill and all her strength and all her grace, could never have written such a letter as that which he still held in his pocket. The best charm of a woman is that she should be soft and trusting and generous, and whoever had been more soft, more trusting, and more generous than his Mary? Of course he would be true to her, though he did lose the world. But to yield such a triumph to the Rattlers and Bonteens whom he left behind him, to let them have their will over him, to know that they would rejoice scurrilously behind his back over his downfall, the feeling was terrible to him. The last words which Bonteen had spoken made it impossible to him now not to support his old friend Mr. Monk. It was not only what Bonteen had said, but that the words of Mr. Bonteen so plainly indicated what would be the words of all the other Bonteens. He knew that he was weak in this. He knew that had he been strong, he would have allowed himself to be guided, if not by the firm decision of his own spirit, by the counsels of such men as Mr. Gresham and Lord Cantrip, and not by the sarcasms of the Bonteens and Rattlers of official life. But men who sojourn amidst savagery fear the mosquito more than they do the lion. He could not bear to think that he should yield his blood to such a one as Bonteen. And he must yield his blood, unless he could vote for Mr. Monk's motion, and hold his ground afterwards among them all in the House of Commons. He would at any rate see the session out, and try a fall with Mr. Bonteen, when they should be sitting on different benches, if ever fortune should give him an opportunity. And in the meantime, what should he do about Madame Goesler? What a fate was his, to have the handsomest woman in London, with thousands and thousands a year at his disposal. For, so he now swore to himself, Madame Goesler was the handsomest woman in London, as Mary Flood Jones was the sweetest girl in the world. He had not arrived at any decision so fixed as to make him comfortable when he went home and dressed for Mrs. Gresham's party, and yet he thought that he knew, that he would be true to Mary Flood Jones. End of chapter 69. Chapters 70 and 71 of Phineas Finn, the Irish Member. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Phineas Finn, the Irish Member, by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 70. The Prime Minister's House. The rooms and passages and staircases at Mrs. Gresham's house were very crowded when Phineas arrived there. Men of all shades of politics were there, and wives and daughters of such men, and there was a streak of royalty in one of the saloons, and a whole rainbow of foreign ministers with their stars and 2 blue ribbons were to be seen together on the first landing-place, with a stout lady between them, carrying diamonds enough to load a pannier. Everybody was there. Phineas found that even Lord Chiltern was come, as he stumbled across his friend on the first foot ground that he gained in his ascent towards the rooms. "Halloa! You here?" said Phineas.
"Yes, by George," said the other, "but I am going to escape as soon as possible. I've been trying to make my way up for the last hour, but could never get round that huge promontory there. Laura was more persevering."
"Is Kennedy here?" Phineas whispered.
"I do not know," said Chiltern, but she was determined to run the chance. A little higher up, for Phineas was blessed with more patience than Lord Chiltern possessed, he came upon Mr. Monk.
"So you are still admitted privately?" said Phineas.
"Oh dear, yes. And we have just been having a most friendly conversation about you. What a man he is! He knows everything. He is so accurate, so just in the abstract, and in the abstract so generous."
"He has been very generous to me in detail as well as in abstract," said Phineas.
"Ah, yes. I am not thinking of individuals exactly. His want of generosity is to large masses, to a party, to classes, to a people, whereas his generosity is for mankind at large. He assumes the god, affects to nod, and seems to shake the spheres. But I have nothing against him. He has asked me here tonight, and has talked to me most familiarly about Ireland."
"What do you think of your chance of a second reading?" asked Phineas.
"What do you think of it? You hear more of those things than I do."
"Everybody says it'll be a close division."
"I never expected it," said Mr. Monk.
"Nor I, till I heard what Daubeny said at the first reading. They will all vote for the bill en masse, hating it in their hearts all the time."
"Let us hope they are not so bad as that."
"It is the way with them always. They do all our work for us, sailing either on one tack or the other. That is their use in creation, that when we split among ourselves, as we always do, they come in and finish our job for us. It must be unpleasant for them to be always doing that which they always say should never be done at all."
"Wherever the gift horse may come from, I shall not look it in the mouth," said Mr. Monk. "There is only one man in the House whom I hope I may not see in the lobby with me, and that is yourself."
"The question is decided now," said Phineas.
"And how is it decided?"
Phineas could not tell his friend that a question of so great magnitude to him had been decided by the last sting which he had received from an insect so contemptible as Mr. Bonteen, but he expressed the feeling as well as he knew how to express it. "Oh, I shall be with you. I know what you are going to say, and I know how good you are. But I could not stand it. Men are beginning already to say things which almost make me get up and kick them. If I can help it, I will give occasion to no man to hint anything to me which can make me so wretched as I have been to-day. Pray do not say anything more. My idea is that I shall resign tomorrow."
"Then I hope that we may fight the battle side by side," said Mr. Monk, giving him his hand.
"We will fight the battle side by side," replied Phineas. After that he pushed his way still higher up the stairs, having no special purpose in view, not dreaming of any such success as that of reaching his host or hostess, merely feeling that it should be a point of honour with him to make a tour through the rooms before he descended the stairs. The thing, he thought, was to be done with courage and patience, and this might, probably, be the last time in his life that he would find himself in the house of a Prime Minister. Just at the turn of the balustrade at the top of the stairs, he found Mr. Gresham in the very spot on which Mr. Monk had been talking with him. "Very glad to see you," said Mr. Gresham. "You, I find, are a persevering man with a genius for getting upwards." "Like the sparks," said Phineas. "Not quite so quickly," said Mr. Gresham, "but with the same assurance of speedy loss of my little light." It did not suit Mr. Gresham to understand this, so he changed the subject. "Have you seen the news from America?" "Yes, I have seen it, but do not believe it," said Phineas. "Ah, you have such faith in a combination of British colonies, properly backed in Downing Street, as to think them strong against a world in arms. In your place I should hold to the same doctrine, hold to it stoutly." "And you do now, I hope, Mr. Gresham." "Well, yes, I'm not downhearted, but I confess to a feeling that the world would go on even though we had nothing to say to a single province in North America. But that is for your private ear. You are not to whisper that in Downing Street." Then there came up somebody else, and Phineas went on upon his slow course. He had longed for an opportunity to tell Mr. Gresham that he could go to Downing Street no more, but such opportunity had not reached him. For a long time he found himself stuck close by the side of Miss Fitzgibbon, Miss Aspasia Fitzgibbon, who had once relieved him from terrible pecuniary anxiety by paying for him a sum of money which was due by him on her brother's account. "It's a very nice thing to be here, but one does get tired of it," said Miss Fitzgibbon. "Very tired," said Phineas. "Of course it is a part of your duty, Mr. Finn. You are on your promotion and are bound to be here. When I asked Laurence to come, he said there was nothing to be got till the cards were shuffled again." "They'll be shuffled very soon," said Phineas. "Whatever colour comes up, you'll hold the trumps, I know," said the lady. "Some hands always hold trumps." He could not explain to Miss Fitzgibbon that it would never again be his fate to hold a single trump in his hand, so he made another fight, and got on a few steps farther. He said a word as he went to half a dozen friends, as friends went with him. He was detained for 5 minutes by Lady Baldock, who was very gracious and very disagreeable. She told him that Violet was in the room, but where she did not know. "She is somewhere with Lady Laura, I believe. And really, Mr. Finn, I do not like it." Lady Baldock had heard that Phineas had quarrelled with Lord Brentford, but had not heard of the reconciliation. "Really, I do not like it. I am told that Mr. Kennedy is in the house, and nobody knows what may happen." "Mr. Kennedy is not likely to say anything." "One cannot tell. And when I hear that a woman is separated from her husband, I always think that she must have been imprudent. It may be uncharitable, but I think it is most safe so to consider." "As far as I have heard the circumstances, Lady Laura was quite right," said Phineas. "That may be so. Gentlemen will always take the lady's part, of course. But I should be very sorry to have a daughter separated from her husband. Very sorry." Phineas, who had nothing now to gain from Lady Baldock's favour, left her abruptly and went on again. He had a great desire to see Lady Laura and Violet together, though he could hardly tell himself why. He had not seen Miss Effingham since his return from Ireland, and he thought that if he met her alone he could hardly have talked to her with comfort. But he knew that if he met her with Lady Laura, she would greet him as a friend, and speak to him as though there were no cause for embarrassment between them. But he was so far disappointed that he suddenly encountered Violet alone. She had been leaning on the arm of Lord Baldock, and Phineas saw her cousin leave her. But he would not be such a coward as to avoid her, especially as he knew that she had seen him. "Oh, Mr. Finn," she said, "do you see that?" "See what?" "Look, there is Mr. Kennedy."
We have heard that it was possible, and Laura made me promise that I would not leave her." Phineas turned his head and saw Mr. Kennedy standing with his back bolt upright against a door-post, with his brow as black as thunder. "She is just opposite to him, where he can see her," said Violet. "Pray take me to her. He will think nothing of you, because I know that you are still friends with both of them. I came away because Lord Baldock wanted to introduce me to Lady Mouser. You know he's going to marry Miss Mouser." Phineas, not caring much about Lord Baldock and Miss Mouser, took Violet's hand upon his arm, and very slowly made his way across the room to the spot indicated. There they found Lady Laura alone, sitting under the upas tree influence of her husband's gaze. There was a concourse of people between them, and Mr. Kennedy did not seem inclined to make any attempt to lessen the distance. But Lady Laura had found it impossible to move while she was under her husband's eyes. "Mr. Finn," she said, "could you find Oswald? I know he is here." "He has gone," said Phineas. "I was speaking to him downstairs." "You have not seen my father? He said he would come." "I have not seen him, but I will search." "No, it will do no good. I cannot stay. His carriage is there, I know, waiting for me." Phineas immediately started off to have the carriage called, and promised to return with as much celerity as he could use. As he went, making his way much quicker through the crowd than he had done when he had no such object for haste, he purposely avoided the door by which Mr. Kennedy had stood. It would have been his nearest way, but his present service, he thought, required that he should keep aloof from the man. But Mr. Kennedy passed through the door and intercepted him in his path. "Is she going?" he asked. "Well, yes, I dare say she may before long. I shall look for Lord Brentford's carriage by and by." "Tell her she need not go because of me. I shall not return. I shall not annoy her here. It would have been much better that a woman in such a plight should not have come to such an assembly." "You would not wish her to shut herself up?" "I would wish her to come back to the home that she has left, and if there be any law in the land, she shall be made to do so. You tell her that I say so." Then Mr. Kennedy fought his way down the stairs, and Phineas Finn followed in his wake. About half an hour afterwards, Phineas returned to the two ladies with tidings that the carriage would be at hand as soon as they could be below. "Did he see you?" said Lady Laura. "Yes, he followed me." "And did he speak to you?" "Yes, he spoke to me." "And what did he say?" And then, in the presence of Violet, Phineas gave the message. He thought it better that it should be given, and were he to decline to deliver it now, it would never be given. "Whether there be law in the land to protect me, or whether there be none, I will never live with him," said Lady Laura. "Is a woman like a head of cattle, that she can be fastened in her crib by force? I will never live with him, though all the judges of the land should decide that I must do so." Phineas thought much of all this as he went to his solitary lodgings. After all, was not the world much better with him than it was with either of these two wretched married beings? And why? He had not, at any rate as yet, sacrificed for money or social gains any of the instincts of his nature. He had been fickle, foolish, vain, uncertain, and perhaps covetous, but as yet he had not been false. Then he took out Mary's last letter and read it again. End of chapter 70. Chapter 71. Comparing Notes. It would perhaps be difficult to decide between Lord Chiltern and Miss Effingham which had been most wrong, or which had been nearest to the right, in the circumstances which had led to their separation. The old lord, wishing to induce his son to undertake work of some sort, and feeling that his own efforts in this direction were worse than useless, had closeted himself with his intended daughter-in-law, and had obtained from her a promise
that she would use her influence with her lover. "Of course I think it right that he should do something," Violet had said. "And he will, if you bid him," replied the Earl. Violet expressed a great doubt as to his willingness of obedience, but nevertheless she promised to do her best, and she did her best. Lord Chiltern, when she spoke to him, knit his brows with an apparent ferocity of anger, which his countenance frequently expressed without any intention of ferocity on his part. He was annoyed, but was not savagely disposed to Violet. As he looked at her, however, he seemed to be very savagely disposed. "What is it you would have me do?" he said. "I would have you choose some occupation, Oswald." "What occupation? What is it that you mean? Ought I to be a shoemaker?" "Not that by preference, I should say, but that, if you please." When her lover had frowned at her, Violet had resolved, had strongly determined, with inward assertions of her own rights, that she would not be frightened by him. "You are talking nonsense, Violet. You know that I cannot be a shoemaker." "You may go into Parliament." "I neither can nor would I if I could. I dislike the life." "You might farm." "I cannot afford it." "You might do anything. You ought to do something. You know that you ought. You know that your father is right in what he says." "That is easily asserted, Violet. But it would, I think, be better that you should take my part than my father's, if it be that you intend to be my wife." "You know that I intend to be your wife. But would you wish that I should respect my husband?" "And will you not do so if you marry me?" he asked. Then Violet looked into his face and saw that the frown was blacker than ever. The great mark down his forehead was deeper and more like an ugly wound than she had ever seen it, and his eyes sparkled with anger, and his face was red as with fiery wrath. If it was so with him when she was no more than engaged to him, how would it be when they should be man and wife? At any rate, she would not fear him, not now at least. "No, Oswald," she said. "If you resolve upon being an idle man, I shall not respect you. It is better that I should tell you the truth." "A great deal better," he said. "How can I respect one whose whole life will be what?" he demanded with a loud shout. "Oswald, you're very rough with me." "What do you say that my life will be?" Then she again resolved that she would not fear him. "It will be discreditable," she said. "It shall not discredit you," he replied. "I will not bring disgrace on one I have loved so well. Violet, after what you have said, we had better part." She was still proud, still determined, and they did part. Though it nearly broke her heart to see him leave her, she bid him go. She hated herself afterwards for her severity to him, but nevertheless she would not submit to recall the words which she had spoken. She had thought him to be wrong, and, so thinking, had conceived it to be her duty and her privilege to tell him what she thought. But she had no wish to lose him, no wish not to be his wife, even though he should be as idle as the wind. She was so constituted that she had never allowed him or any other man to be master of her heart, till she had, with a full purpose, given her heart away. The day before she had resolved to give it to one man, she might, I think, have resolved to give it to another. Love had not conquered her, but had been taken into her service. Nevertheless, she could not now rid herself of her servant, when she found that his services would stand her no longer in good stead. She parted from Lord Chiltern with an assent, with an assured brow, and with much dignity in her gait. But as soon as she was alone, she was a prey to remorse. She had declared to the man who was to have been her husband that his life was discreditable, and of course no man would bear such language. Had Lord Chiltern borne it, he would not have been worthy of her love. She herself told Lady Laura and Lord Brentford what had occurred, and had told Lady Baldock also. Lady Baldock had, of course, triumphed, and Violet sought her revenge by swearing that she would regret for ever the loss of so inestimable a gentleman. "Then why have you given him up, my dear?" demanded Lady Baldock. "Because I found that he was too good for me," said Violet. It may be doubtful whether Lady Baldock was not justified when she declared that her niece was to her a care so harassing that no aunt known in history had ever been so troubled before. Lord Brentford had fussed and fumed, and had certainly made things worse. He had quarrelled with his son, and then made it up, and then quarrelled again, swearing that the fault must all be attributed to Chiltern's stubbornness and Chiltern's temper. Latterly, however, by Lady Laura's intervention, Lord Brentford and his son had again been reconciled, and the Earl endeavoured manfully to keep his tongue from disagreeable words and his face from evil looks when his son was present. "They will make it up," Lady Laura had said, "if you and I do not attempt to make it up for them. If we do, they will never come together." The Earl was convinced, and did his best, but the task was very difficult to him. How was he to keep his tongue off his son, while his son was daily saying things of which any father, any such father as Lord Brentford, could not but disapprove? Lord Chiltern professed to disbelieve even in the wisdom of the House of Lords, and on one occasion asserted that it must be a great comfort to any Prime Minister to have 3 or 4 old women in the Cabinet. The father, when he heard this, tried to rebuke his son tenderly, strove even to be jocose. It was the one wish of his heart that Violet Effingham should be his daughter-in-law, but even with this wish he found it very hard to keep his tongue off Lord Chiltern. When Lady Laura discussed the matter with Violet, Violet would always declare that there was no hope. "The truth is," she said on the morning of that day in which they both went to Mrs. Gresham's, "that though we like each other, love each other, if you choose to say so, we are not fit to be man and wife." "And why not fit?" "We are too much alike. Each is too violent, too headstrong, and too masterful." "You, as the woman, ought to give way," said Lady Laura. "But we do not always do just what we ought." "I know how difficult it is for me to advise, seeing to what a pass I have brought myself." "Do not say that, dear, or rather do say it, for we have, both of us, brought ourselves to what you call a pass, to such a pass that we are like to be able to live together and discuss it for the rest of our lives. The difference is, I take it, that you have not to accuse yourself, and I have." "I cannot say that I have not to accuse myself," said Lady Laura. "I do not know that I have done much wrong to Mr. Kennedy since I married him, but in marrying him I did him a grievous wrong." "And he has avenged himself." "We will not talk of vengeance. I believe he is wretched, and I know that I am, and that has come of the wrong that I have done." "I will make no man wretched," said Violet. "Do you mean that your mind is made up against Oswald?" "I mean that, and I mean much more. I say that I will make no man wretched. Your brother is not the only man who is so weak as to be willing to run the hazard." "There is Lord Fawn." "Yes, there is Lord Fawn, certainly. Perhaps I should not do him much harm, but then I should do him no good." "And poor Phineas Finn?" "Yes, there is Mr. Finn. I will tell you something, Laura. The only man I ever saw in the world whom I have thought for a moment that it was possible that I should like enough to love as my husband, except your brother, was Mr. Finn." "And now?" "Oh, now. Of course that is over," said Violet. "It is over?" "Quite over. Is he not going to marry Madame Goesler? I suppose all that is fixed by this time. I hope she will be good to him, and gracious, and let him have his own way. and give him his tea comfortably when he comes up tired from the house, for I confess that my heart is a little tender towards Phineas still. I should not like to think that he had fallen into the hands of a female Philistine. I do not think he will marry Madame Goesler. Why not? I can hardly tell you, but I do not think he will. And you loved him once, eh, Violet? Not quite that, my dear. It has been difficult with me to love. The difficulty with most girls, I fancy, is not to love. Mr. Finn, when I came to measure him in my mind, was not small, but he was never quite tall enough. One feels oneself to be a sort of recruiting sergeant, going about with a standard of inches. Mr. Finn was just half an inch too short. He lacks something in individuality. He is a little too much a friend to everybody. Shall I tell you a secret, Violet? If you please, dear, though I fancy it is one I know already. He is the only man whom I ever loved, said Lady Laura. But it was too late when you learned to love him, said Violet. It was too late when I was so sure of it as to wish that I had never seen Mr. Kennedy. I felt it coming on me, and I argued with myself that such a marriage would be bad for us both. At that moment there was trouble in the family, and I had not a shilling of my own. You had paid it for Oswald. At any rate, I had nothing, and he had nothing. How could I have dared to think even of such a marriage? Did he think of it, Laura? I suppose he did. You know he did. Did you not tell me before? Well, yes, he thought of it. I had come to some foolish, half-sentimental resolution as to friendship, believing that he and I could be knit together by some adhesion of fraternal affection that should be void of offence to my husband, and in furtherance of this he was asked to Loughlinter when I went there, just after I had accepted Robert. He came down, and I measured him too, as you have done. I measured him, and found that he wanted nothing to come up to the height required by my standard. I think I knew him better than you did. Very possibly, but why measure him at all when such measurement was useless? Can one help such things? He came to me one day as I was sitting up by the linter. You remember the place where it makes its first leap? I remember it very well. So do I. Robert had shown it to me as the fairest spot in all Scotland. And there this lover of ours sang his song to you. I do not know what he told me then, but I know that I told him that I was engaged, and I felt when I told him so that my engagement was a sorrow to me, and it has been a sorrow from that day to this. And the hero Phineas, he is still dear to you? Dear to me? Yes. He would have hated me had he become my husband, and he will hate Madame Goesler when she becomes his wife. Not in the least. I'm no dog in the manger. I have even gone so far as almost to wish, at certain moments, that you should accept him. And why? Because he has wished it so heartily. One can hardly forgive a man for such speedy changes, said Violet. Was I not to forgive him? I, who had turned myself away from him with a fixed purpose the moment that I found that he had made a mark upon my heart? I could not wipe off the mark, and yet I married. Was he not to try to wipe off his mark? It seems that he wiped it off very quickly, and since that he has wiped off another mark. One doesn't know how many marks he has wiped off. They are like the innkeeper's score which he makes in chalk. A damp cloth brings them all away and leaves nothing behind. What would you have? There should be a little notch on the stick to remember by, said Violet. Not that I complain, you know. I cannot complain, but I was not notched myself. Oh, you are silly, Violet, in not having allowed myself to be notched by this great champion. A man like Mr. Finn has his life to deal with. to make the most of it, and to divide it between work, pleasure, duty, ambition, and the rest of it as best he may. If he have any softness of heart, it will be necessary to him that love should bear a part in all these interests. But a man will be a fool who will allow love to be the master of them all. He will be one whose mind is so ill-balanced as to allow him to be the victim of a single wish. Even in a woman, passion such as that is evidence of weakness and not of strength.
It seems, then, Laura, that you are weak.
And if I am, does that condemn him? He is a man, if I judge him rightly, who will be constant as the sun when constancy can be of service.
You mean that the future Mrs. Finn will be secure?
That is what I mean, and that you or I, had either of us chosen to take his name, might have been quite secure. We have thought it right to refuse to do so.
And how many more, I wonder?
You are unjust and unkind, Violet. So unjust and unkind that it is clear to me he has just gratified your vanity and has never touched your heart. What would you have him do when I told him that I was engaged?
I suppose that Mr. Kennedy would not have gone to Blankenberg with him.
Violet! That seems to be the proper thing to do, but even that does not adjust things finally, does it? Then someone came upon them, and the conversation was brought to an end. End of chapter 71.
Chapter 72 of Phineas Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, contact LibriVox.org. Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 72. Madame Goesler's Generosity. When Phineas Finn left Mr. Gresham's house, he had quite resolved what he would do. On the next morning he would tell Lord Cantrip that his resignation was a necessity, and that he would take that nobleman's advice as to resigning at once, or waiting till the day on which Mr. Monk's Irish bill would be read for the second time. "My dear Finn, I can only say that I deeply regret it," said Lord Cantrip. "So do I. I regret to leave office, which I like, and which, indeed, I want. I regret specially to leave this office, as it has been a thorough pleasure to me, and I regret above all to leave you. But I am convinced that Monk is right, and I find it impossible not to support him." "I wish that Mr. Monk was at Bath," said Lord Cantrip. Phineas could only smile and shrug his shoulders, and say that even though Mr. Monk were at Bath, it would not probably make much difference. When he tendered his letter of resignation, Lord Cantrip begged him to withdraw it for a day or two. He would, he said, speak to Mr. Gresham. The debate on the second reading of Mr. Monk's bill would not take place till that day week, and the resignation would be in time if it was tendered before Phineas either spoke or voted against the government. So Phineas went back to his room, and endeavoured to make himself useful in some work appertaining to his favourite colonies. That conversation had taken place on a Friday, and on the following Sunday, early in the day, he left his rooms after a late breakfast. A prolonged breakfast, during which he had been studying tenant right statistics, preparing his own speech, and endeavouring to look forward into the future which that speech was to do so much to influence, and turned his face towards Park Lane. There had been a certain understanding between him and Madame Goesler that he was to call in Park Lane on this Sunday morning, and then declare to her what was his final resolve as to the office which he held. "It is simply to bid her adieu," he said to himself, "for I shall hardly see her again." And yet, as he took off his morning easy coat, and dressed himself for the streets, and stood for a moment before his looking-glass, and saw that his gloves were fresh, and that his boots were properly polished, I think there was a care about his person which he would have hardly taken had he been quite assured that he simply intended to say good-bye to the lady whom he was about to visit. But if there were any such conscious feeling, he administered to himself an antidote before he left the house. On returning to the sitting-room he went to a little desk, from which he took out the letter from Mary which the reader has seen, and carefully perused every word of it. "She is the best of them all," he said to himself, as he refolded the letter and put it back into his desk. I am not sure that it is well that a man should have any large number from whom to select a best, as in such circumstances he is so very apt to change his judgment from hour to hour. The qualities which are the most attractive before dinner sometimes become the least so in the evening. The morning was warm, and he took a cab. It would not do that he should speak even his last farewell to such a one as Madame Goesler, with all the heat and dust of a long walk upon him. Having been so careful about his boots and gloves, he might as well use his care to the end. Madame Goesler was a very pretty woman, who spared herself no trouble in making herself as pretty as nature would allow, on behalf of those whom she favoured with her smiles. And to such a lady some special attention was due by one who had received so many of her smiles as had Phineas. And he felt, too, that there was something special in this very visit. It was to be made by appointment, and there had come to be an understanding between them that Phineas should tell her on this occasion what was his resolution with reference to his future life. I think that he had been very wise in fortifying himself with a further glance at our dear Mary's letter, before he trusted himself within Madame Goesler's door. Yes, Madame Goesler was at home. The door was opened by Madame Goesler's own maid, who, smiling, explained that the other servants were all at church. Phineas had become sufficiently intimate at the cottage in Park Lane to be on friendly terms with Madame Goesler's own maid, and now made some little half-familiar remark as to the propriety of his visit during church time. "Madame will not refuse to see you, I am thinking," said the girl, who was a German. "And she is alone?" asked Phineas. "Alone? Yes, of course she is alone. Who should be with her now?" Then she took him up into the drawing-room, but when there he found that Madame Goesler was absent. "She shall be down directly," said the girl. "I shall tell her who is here, and she will come." It was a very pretty room. It may almost be said that there could be no prettier room in all London. It looked out across certain small private gardens, which were as bright and gay as money could make them, when brought into competition with London smoke, right on to the park. Outside and inside the window, flowers and green things were so arranged that the room itself almost looked as though it were a bower in a garden. And everything in that bower was rich and rare, and there was nothing there which annoyed by its rarity, or was distasteful by its richness. The seats, though they were costly as money could buy, were meant for sitting, and were comfortable as seats. There were books for reading, and the means of reading them. 2 or 3 gems of English art were hung upon the walls, and could be seen backwards and forwards in the mirrors. And there were precious toys lying here and there about the room, toys very precious, but placed there not because of their price, but because of their beauty. Phineas already knew enough of the art of living to be aware that the woman who had made that room what it was had charms to add a beauty to everything she touched. What would such a life as his want, if graced by such a companion? Such a life as his might be, if the means which were hers were at his command. It would want one thing, he thought, the self-respect which he would lose if he were false to the girl who was trusting him with such sweet trust at home in Ireland. In a very few minutes Madame Goesler was with him, and though he did not think about it, he perceived that she was bright in her apparel, that her hair was as soft as care could make it, and that every charm belonging to her had been brought into use for his gratification. He almost told himself that he was there in order that he might ask to have all those charms bestowed upon himself. He did not know who had lately come to Park Lane and been a suppliant for the possession of those rich endowments, but I wonder whether they would have been more precious in his eyes had he known that they had so moved the heart of the great Duke as to have induced him to lay his coronet at the lady's feet. I think that had he known that the lady had refused the coronet, that knowledge would have enhanced the value of the prize. "I am so sorry to have kept you waiting," she said, as she gave him her hand. "I was an owl not to be ready for you when you told me that you would come." "No, but a bird of paradise to come to me so sweetly, and at an hour when all the other birds refuse to show the feather of a single wing." "And you feel like a naughty boy, do you not, in thus coming out on a Sunday morning?" "Do you feel like a naughty girl?" "Yes, just a little so. I do not know that I should care for everybody to hear that I received visitors, or, worse still, a visitor, at this hour on this day. But then it is so pleasant to feel oneself to be naughty. There is a bohemian flavour of picnic about it which, though it does not come up to the rich gusto of real wickedness, makes one fancy that one is on the border of that delightful region in which there is none of the constraint of custom, where men and women say what they like and do what they like." "It is pleasant enough to be on the borders," said Phineas. "That is just it. Of course, decency, morality, and propriety, all made to suit the eye of the public, are the things which are really delightful. We all know that, and live accordingly, as well as we can. I do, at least." "And do not I, Madame Goesler?" "I know nothing about that, Mr. Finn, and want to ask no questions. But if you do, I am sure you agree with me that you often envy the improper people, the Bohemians, the people who don't trouble themselves about keeping any laws, except those for breaking, which they would be put into nasty, unpleasant prisons. I envy them. Oh, how I envy them!" "But you are free as air." "The most cabined, cribbed, and confined creature in the world. I have been fighting my way up for the last 4 years, and have not allowed myself the liberty of one flirtation, not often even the recreation of a natural laugh. And now I shouldn't wonder if I don't find myself falling back a year or two, just because I have allowed you to come and see me on a Sunday morning. When I told Lotta that you were coming, she shook her head at me in dismay. But now that you are here, tell me what you have done." "Nothing as yet, Madame Goesler." "I thought it was to have been settled on Friday." "It was settled before Friday. Indeed, as I look back at it all now, I can hardly tell when it was not settled. It is impossible, and has been impossible, that I should do otherwise. I still hold my place, Madame Goesler, but I have declared that I shall give it up before the debate comes on." "Is it quite fixed?" "Quite fixed, my friend." "And what next?" Madame Goesler, as she thus interrogated him, was leaning across towards him from the sofa on which she was placed, with both her elbows resting on a small table before her. We all know that look of true interest which the countenance of a real friend will bear when the welfare of his friend is in question. There are doubtless some who can assume it without feeling, as there are actors who can personate all the passions. But in ordinary life we think that we can trust such a face, and that we know the true look when we see it. Phineas, as he gazed into Madame Goesler's eyes, was sure that the lady opposite him was not acting. She, at least, was anxious for his welfare, and was making his cares her own. "What next?" said she, repeating her words in a tone that was somewhat hurried. "I do not know that there will be any next. As far as public life is concerned, there will be no next for me, Madame Goesler." "That is out of the question," she said. "You are made for public life." "Then I shall be untrue to my making, I fear. But to speak plainly—" "Yes, speak plainly. I want to understand the reality." "The reality is this. I shall keep my seat to the end of the session, as I think I may be of use. After that I shall give it up." "Resign that too?" she said in a tone of chagrin. "The chances are, I think, that there will be another dissolution. If they hold their own against Mr. Monk's motion, then they will pass an Irish Reform Bill. After that I think they must dissolve." "And you will not come forward again?" "I cannot afford it." "Psha! Some £500 or so." "And, besides that, I am well aware that my only chance at my old profession is to give up all idea of Parliament. The two things are not compatible for a beginner at the law. I know it now, and have bought my knowledge by a bitter experience." "And where will you live?" "In Dublin, probably." "And you will do what?" "Anything honest in a barrister's way that may be brought to me. I hope that I may never descend below that." "You will stand up for all the blackguards, and try to make out that the thieves did not steal?" "It may be that that sort of work may come in my way." "And you will wear a wig and try to look wise?" "The wig is not universal in Ireland, Madame Goesler." "And you will wrangle, as though your very soul were in it, for somebody's £20? "Exactly." "You have already made a name in the greatest Senate in the world, and have governed other countries larger than your own." "No, I have not done that. I have governed no country." "I tell you, my friend, that you cannot do it. It is out of the question. Men may move forward from little work to big work, but they cannot move back and do little work when they have had tasks which were really great. I tell you, Mr. Finn, that the House of Parliament is the place for you to work in. It is the only place, that and the abodes of ministers. Am not I your friend who tell you this?" "I know that you are my friend." "And will you not credit me when I tell you this? What do you fear that you should run away? You have no wife, no children. What is the coming misfortune that you dread?" She paused a moment as though for an answer, and he felt that now had come the time in which it would be well that he should tell her of his engagement with his own Mary. She had received him very playfully, but now, within the last few minutes, there had come upon her a seriousness of gesture, and almost a solemnity of tone, which made him conscious that he should in no way trifle with her. She was so earnest in her friendship that he owed it to her to tell her everything. But before he could think of the words in which his tale should be told, she had gone on with her quick questions. "Is it solely about money that you fear?" she said. "It is simply that I have no income on which to live." "Have I not offered you money?" "But, Madame Goesler, you who offer it would yourself despise me if I took it." "No, I do deny it." As she said this, not loudly but with much emphasis, she came and stood before him where he was sitting. And as he looked at her, he could perceive that there was a strength about her of which he had not been aware. She was stronger, larger, more robust physically than he had hitherto conceived. "I do deny it," she said. "Money is neither God nor devil, that it should make one noble and another vile. It is an accident, and, if honestly possessed, may pass from you to me, or from me to you, without a stain. You may take my dinner from me if I give it you, my flowers, my friendship, my everything but my money. Explain to me the cause of the phenomenon. If I give to you £1,000 now, this moment, and you take it, you are base. But if I leave it you in my will, and die, you take it, and are not base. Explain to me the cause of that." "You have not said it quite all," said Phineas hoarsely. "What have I left unsaid? If I have left anything unsaid, do you say the rest." "It is because you are a woman, and young, and beautiful, that no man may take wealth from your hands." "Oh, it is that?" "It is that partly." "If I were a man, you might take it, though I were young and beautiful as the morning?" "No. Presents of money are always bad. They stain and load the spirit and break the heart." "And specially when given by a woman's hand?" "It seems so to me. But I cannot argue of it. Do not let us talk of it any more." "Nor can I argue. I cannot argue, but I can be generous, very generous. I can deny myself for my friend, can even lower myself in my own esteem for my friend. I can do more than a man can do for a friend. You will not take money from my hand?" "No, Madame Goesler, I cannot do that." "Take the hand then first. When it and all that it holds are your own, you can help yourself as you list." So saying, she stood before him, with her right hand stretched out towards him. What man will say that he would not have been tempted? Or what woman will declare that such temptation should have had no force? The very air of the room in which she dwelt was sweet in his nostrils, and there hovered around her an halo of grace and beauty which greeted all his senses. She invited him to join his lot to hers, in order that she might give to him all that was needed to make his life rich and glorious. How would the Rattlers and the Bonteens envy him when they heard of the prize which had become his! The Cantrips and the Greshams would feel that he was a friend doubly valuable, if he could be won back, and Mr. Monk would greet him as a fitting ally, an ally strong with the strength which he had before wanted. With whom would he not be equal? Whom need he fear? Who would not praise him? The story of his poor Mary would be known only in a small village, out beyond the Channel. The temptation certainly was very strong. But he had not a moment in which to doubt. She was standing there with her face turned from him, but with her hand still stretched towards him. Of course he took it. What man so placed could do other than take a woman's hand? "My friend," he said. "I will be called friend by you no more," she said. "You must call me Marie, your own Marie, or you must never call me by any name again. Which shall it be, sir?" He paused a moment, holding her hand, and she let it lie there for an instant while she listened. But still she did not look at him. "Speak to me. Tell me. Which shall it be?" Still he paused. "Speak to me. Tell me," she said again. "It cannot be as you have hinted to me," he said at last. His words did not come louder than a low whisper, but they were plainly heard, and instantly the hand was withdrawn. "Cannot be!" she exclaimed. "Then I have betrayed myself." "No, Madame Goesler." "Sir, I say yes. If you will allow me, I will leave you. You will, I know, excuse me if I am abrupt to you." Then she strode out of the room, and was no more seen of the eyes of Phineas Finn. He never afterwards knew how he escaped out of that room and found his way into Park Lane. In after days he had some memory that he remained there, he knew not how long, standing on the very spot on which she had left him, and that at last there grew upon him almost a fear of moving, a dread lest he should be heard, an inordinate desire to escape without the sound of a footfall, without the clicking of a lock. Everything in that house had been offered to him. He had refused it all, and then felt that of all human beings under the sun, none had so little right to be standing there as he. His very presence in that drawing-room was an insult to the woman whom he had driven from it. But at length he was in the street, and had found his way across Piccadilly into the Green Park. Then, as soon as he could find a spot apart from the Sunday world, he threw himself upon the turf, and tried to fix his thoughts upon the thing that he had done. His first feeling, I think, was one of pure and unmixed disappointment, of disappointment so bitter that even the vision of his own Mary did not tend to comfort him. How great might have been his success, and how terrible was his failure! Had he taken the woman's hand and her money, had he clenched his grasp on the great prize offered to him, his misery would have been 10 times worse the first moment that he would have been away from her. Then, indeed, it being so that he was a man with a heart within his breast, there would have been no comfort for him in his outlooks on any side. But even now, when he had done right, knowing well that he had done right, he found that comfort did not come readily within his reach. End of chapter 72. Recording by Laura Koskinen.
Chapter 73 of Phineas Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 73, Amantium Irae. Miss Effingham's life at this time was not the happiest in the world. Her lines, as she once said to her friend Lady Laura, were not laid for her in pleasant places. Her residence was still with her aunt, and she had come to find that it was almost impossible any longer to endure Lady Baldock, and quite impossible to escape from Lady Baldock. In former days she had had a dream that she might escape, and live alone if she chose to be alone, that she might be independent in her life as a man is independent, if she chose to live after that fashion, that she might take her own fortune in her own hand, as the law certainly allowed her to do, and act with it as she might please. But latterly she had learned to understand that all this was not possible for her. Though one law allowed it, another law disallowed it, and the latter law was at least as powerful as the former. And then her present misery was enhanced by the fact that she was now banished from the second home which she had formerly possessed. Hitherto she had always been able to escape from Lady Baldock to the house of her friend, but now such escape was out of the question. Lady Laura and Lord Chiltern lived in the same house, and Violet could not live with them. Lady Baldock understood all this, and tortured her niece accordingly. It was not premeditated torture. The aunt did not mean to make her niece's life a burden to her, and so intending systematically work upon a principle to that effect. Lady Baldock no doubt desired to do her duty conscientiously, but the result was torture to poor Violet, and a strong conviction on the mind of each of the two ladies that the other was the most unreasonable being in the world. The aunt in these days had taken it into her head to talk of poor Lord Chiltern. This arose partly from the belief that the quarrel was final, and that, therefore, there would be no danger in aggravating Violet by this expression of pity, partly from a feeling that it would be better that her niece should marry Lord Chiltern than that she should not marry at all, and partly, perhaps, from the general principle that, as she thought it right to scold her niece on all occasions, this might be best done by taking an opposite view of all questions to that taken by the niece to be scolded. Violet was supposed to regard Lord Chiltern as having sinned against her, and therefore Lady Baldock talked of poor Lord Chiltern. As to the other lovers, she had begun to perceive that their conditions were hopeless. Her daughter Augusta had explained to her that there was no chance remaining either for Phineas, or for Lord Fawn, or for Mr. Appledom. "I believe she will be an old maid on purpose to bring me to my grave," said Lady Baldock. When, therefore, Lady Baldock was told one day that Lord Chiltern was in the house and was asking to see Miss Effingham, she did not at once faint away and declare that they would all be murdered, as she would have done some months since. She was perplexed by a double duty. If it were possible that Violet should relent and be reconciled, then it would be her duty to save Violet from the claws of the wild beast. But if there was no such chance, then it would be her duty to poor Lord Chiltern to see that he was not treated with contumely and ill humour. "Does she know that he is here?" Lady Baldock asked her daughter. "Not yet, mamma." Oh dear, I suppose she ought to see him. She has given him so much encouragement." "I suppose she will do as she pleases, mamma." "Augusta, how can you talk in that way? Am I to have no control in my own house?" It was, however, soon apparent to her that in this matter she was to have no control. "Lord Chiltern is downstairs," said Violet, coming into the room abruptly. "So Augusta tells me. Sit down, my dear." "I cannot sit down, aunt, not just now. I've sent down to say that I would be with him in a minute. He's the most impatient soul alive, and I must not keep him waiting." "And you mean to see him?" "Certainly I shall see him," said Violet as she left the room. "I wonder that any woman should ever take upon herself the charge of a niece," said Lady Baldock to her daughter in a despondent tone as she held up her hands in dismay. In the meantime, Violet had gone downstairs with a quick step, and had then boldly entered the room in which her lover was waiting to receive her. "I have to thank you for coming to me, Violet," said Lord Chiltern. There was still in his face something of savagery, an expression partly of anger and partly of resolution to tame the thing with which he was angry. Violet did not regard the anger half so keenly as she did that resolution of taming. An angry lord, she thought, she could endure, but she could not bear the idea of being tamed by anyone. "Why should I not come?" she said. "Of course I came when I was told that you were here. I do not think that there need to be a quarrel between us because we have changed our minds." "Such changes make quarrels," said he. "It shall not do so with me, unless you choose that it shall," said Violet. "Why would we be enemies, we who have known each other since we were children? My dearest friends are your father and your sister. Why should we be enemies?" "I have come to ask you whether you think that I have ill-used you." "Ill-used me? Certainly not. Has anyone told you that I have accused you?" "No one has told me so." "Then why do you ask me?" "Because I would not have you think so, if I could help it. I did not intend to be rough with you. When you told me that my life was disreputable—" "Oh, Oswald, do not let us go back to that. What good will it do?" "But you said so." "I think not." "I believe that was your word, the harshest word that you could use in all the language." "I did not mean to be harsh. If I used it, I will beg your pardon. Only let there be an end of it. As we think so differently about life in general, it was better that we should not be married. But that is settled, and why should we go back to words that were spoken in haste and which are simply disagreeable?" "I have come to know whether it is settled." "Certainly, you settled it yourself, Oswald. I told you what I thought myself bound to tell you. Perhaps I used language which I should not have used. Then you told me that I could not be your wife. and I thought you were right, quite right." "I was wrong, quite wrong," he said impetuously. "So wrong that I can never forgive myself if you do not relent. I am such a fool that I cannot forgive myself my folly. I had known before that I would not live without you, and when you were mine, I threw you away with an angry word." "It was not an angry word," she said. "Say it again, and let me have another chance to answer it." "I think I said that idleness was not respectable, or something like that, taken out of a copybook, probably. But you are a man who do not like rebukes, even out of copybooks. A man so thin-skinned as you are must choose for himself a wife with a softer tongue than mine." "I will choose none other," he said. But still he was savage in his tone and in his gestures. "I made my choice long since, as you well know. I do not change easily. I cannot change in this. Violet, say that you will be my wife once more, and I will swear to work for you like a coal-heaver." "My wish is that my husband, should I ever have one, should work, not exactly as a coal-heaver." "Oh, come, Violet," he said, and now the look of savagery departed from him, and there came a smile over his face, which, however, had in it more of sadness than of hope or joy. "Treat me fairly, or rather, treat me generously if you can. I do not know whether you ever loved me much." "Very much, years ago, when you were a boy." "But not since. If it be so, I had better go. Love on one side only is a poor affair at best." "A very poor affair." "It is better to bear anything than to try and make life out with that. Some of you women never want to love anyone." "That was what I was saying of myself to Laura but the other day. With some women it is so easy. With others it is so difficult that perhaps it never comes to them." "And with you?" "Oh, with me. But it is better in these matters to confine oneself to generalities. If you please, I will not describe myself personally. Were I to do so, doubtless I should do it falsely." "You love no one else, Violet?" "That is my affair, my lord." "By heavens, and it is mine too. Tell me that you do, and I will go away and leave you at once. I will not ask his name, and I will trouble you no more. If it is not so, and if it is possible that you should forgive me—" "Forgive you? When have I been angry with you?" "Answer me my question, Violet." "I will not answer your question, not that one." "What question will you answer?" "Any that may concern yourself and myself, none that may concern other people." "You told me once that you loved me." "This moment I told you that I did so, years ago." "But now?" "That is another matter." "Violet, do you love me now?"
"That is a point-blank question, at any rate," she said.
"And you will answer it?"
"I must answer it, I suppose."
"Well, then."
"Oh, Oswald, what a fool you are! Love you? Of course I love you. If you can understand anything, you ought to know that I have never loved anyone else. That, after what has passed between us, I shall never love anyone else. I do love you. There. Whether you throw me away from you, as you did the other day, with great scorn, mind you, or come to me with sweet, beautiful promises as you do now, I shall love you all the same. I cannot be your wife if you will not have me, can I? When you run away in your tantrums because I quote something out of a copybook, I can't run after you. It would not be pretty. But as for loving you, if you doubt that, I tell you, you are a fool." As she spoke the last words, she pouted out her lips at him, and when he looked into her face, he saw that her eyes were full of tears. He was standing now with his arm round her waist, so that it was not easy for him to look into her face.
"I am a fool," he said.
"Yes, you are, but I don't love you the less on that account."
"I will never doubt it again."
"No, do not. And for me, I will not say another word. Whether you choose to heave coals or not, you shall do as you please. I meant to be very wise. I did indeed."
"You are the grandest girl that ever was made."
"I do not want to be grand at all, and I never will be wise any more. And you do not frown at me and look savage?"
Then she put up her hand to smooth his brow.
"I am half afraid of you still, you know. There, that will do. Now let me go, that I may tell my aunt. During the last 2 months she has been full of pity for poor Lord Chiltern."
"It has been poor Lord Chiltern with a vengeance," said he. "But now that we have made it up, she will be horrified again at all your wickednesses. You've been a turtle-dove lately. Now you will be an ogre again. But, Oswald, you must not be an ogre to me." As soon as she could get quit of her lover, she did tell her tale to Lady Baldock. "You have accepted him again," said her aunt, holding up her hands. "Yes, I have accepted him again," replied Violet. "Then the responsibility must be on your shoulders," said her aunt. "I wash my hands of it." That evening, when she discussed the matter with her daughter, Lady Baldock spoke of Violet and Lord Chiltern, as though their intended marriage was the one thing in the world which she most deplored. End of chapter 53. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 74 of Phineas Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 74. The Beginning of the End. The day of the debate had come, and Phineas Finn was still sitting in his room at the Colonial Office. But his resignation had been sent in and accepted, and he was simply awaiting the coming of his successor. About noon his successor came, and he had the gratification of resigning his armchair to Mr. Bonteen. It is generally understood that gentlemen leaving offices give up either seals or a portfolio. Phineas had been put in possession of no seal and no portfolio, but there was in the room which he had occupied a special armchair, and this, with much regret, he surrendered to the use and comfort of Mr. Bonteen. There was a glance of triumph in his enemy's eyes, and an exultation in the tone of his enemy's voice, which were very bitter to him. "So you are really going?" said Mr. Bonteen. "Well, I dare say it is all very proper. I don't quite understand the thing myself, but I have no doubt you are right." "It isn't easy to understand, is it?" said Phineas, trying to laugh. But Mr. Bonteen did not feel the intended satire, and poor Phineas found it useless to attempt to punish the man he hated. He left him as quickly as he could, and went to say a few words of farewell to his late chief. "Good-bye, Finn," said Lord Cantrip. "It is a great trouble to me that we should have to part in this way." "And to me also, my lord. I wish it could have been avoided." "You should not have gone to Ireland with so dangerous a man as Mr. Monk. But it is too late to think of that now." "The milk is spilt, is it not?" "But these terrible rendings asunder never last very long," said Lord Cantrip, "unless a man changes his opinions altogether. How many quarrels and how many reconciliations we have lived to see. I remember when Gresham went out of office because he could not sit in the same room with Mr. Mildmay, and yet they became the fastest of political friends. There was a time when Plinlimmon and the Duke could not stable their horses together at all. And don't you remember when Palliser was obliged to give up his hopes of office because he had some bee in his bonnet?" I think, however, that the bee in Mr. Palliser's bonnet to which Lord Cantrip was alluding made its buzzing audible on some subject that was not exactly political. "We'll have you back again before long, I don't doubt. Men who can really do their work are too rare to be left long in the comfort of the benches below the gangway." This was very kindly said, and Phineas was flattered and comforted. He could not, however, make Lord Cantrip understand the whole truth. For him the dream of a life of politics was over for ever. He had tried it, and had succeeded beyond his utmost hopes. But in spite of his success, the ground had crumbled to pieces beneath his feet, and he knew that he could never recover the niche in the world's gallery which he was now leaving. That same afternoon he met Mr. Gresham in one of the passages leading to the house, and the Prime Minister put his arm through that of our hero as they walked together into the lobby. "I am sorry that we are losing you," said Mr. Gresham. "You may be sure that I am sorry to be so lost," said Phineas. "These things will occur in political life," said the leader, "but I think that they seldom leave rancour behind them when the purpose is declared, and when the subject of disagreement is marked and understood. The defalcation which creates angry feeling is that which has to be endured without previous warning, when a man votes against his party, or a set of men from private pique, or some cause which is never clear. Phineas, when he heard this, knew well how terribly this very man had been harassed and driven nearly wild by defalcation, exactly of that nature which he was attempting to describe. "No doubt you and Mr. Monk think you are all right?" continued Mr. Gresham. "We have given strong evidence that we think so," said Phineas. "We give up our places, and we are, both of us, very poor men." "I think you are wrong, you know, not so much in your views on the question itself, which, to tell the truth, I hardly understand as yet." "We will endeavour to explain them, and will do so very clearly, no doubt. But I think that Mr. Monk was wrong in desiring, as a member of a government, to force a measure which, whether good or bad, the government as a body does not desire to initiate, at any rate just now." "And therefore he resigned," said Phineas. "Of course. But it seems to me that he failed to comprehend the only way in which a great party can act together, if it is to do any service to this country. Don't for a moment think that I am blaming him or you." "I am nobody in this matter," said Phineas. "I can assure you, Mr. Finn, that we have not regarded you in that light, and I hope that the time may come when we may be sitting together again on the same bench." Neither on the Treasury bench nor any other in that house was he to sit again after this fashion. That was the trouble which was crushing his spirit at this moment, and not the loss of his office. He knew that he could not venture to think of remaining in London as a member of Parliament with no other income than that which his father could allow him, even if he could again secure a seat in Parliament. When he had first been returned for Loughshane, he had assured his friends that his duty as a member of the House of Commons would not be a bar to his practice in the courts. He had now been 5 years a member, and had never once made an attempt at doing any part of a barrister's work. He had gone altogether into a different line of life, and had been most successful, so successful that men told him, and women more frequently than men, that his career had been a miracle of success. But there had been, as he had well known from the first, this drawback in the new profession which he had chosen, that nothing in it could be permanent. They who succeed in it may probably succeed again, but then the success is intermittent, and there may be years of hard work in opposition, to which, unfortunately, no pay is assigned. It is almost imperative, as he now found, that they who devote themselves to such a profession should be men of fortune. When he had commenced his work, at the period of his first return for Loughshane, he had had no thought of mending his deficiency in this respect by a rich marriage, nor had it ever occurred to him that he would seek a marriage for that purpose. Such an idea would have been thoroughly distasteful to him. There had been no stain of premeditated mercenary arrangement upon him at any time. But circumstances had so fallen out with him that as he won his spurs in Parliament, as he became known, and was placed first in one office and then in another, prospects of love and money together were opened to him, and he ventured on, leaving Mr. Lowe and the law behind him, because these prospects were so alluring. Then had come Mr. Monk and Mary Flood Jones, and everything around him had collapsed. Everything around him had collapsed, with, however, a terrible temptation to him to inflate his sails again, at the cost of his truth and his honour. The temptation would have affected him not at all, had Madame Goesler been ugly, stupid, or personally disagreeable. But she was, he thought, the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, the most witty, and in many respects the most charming. She had offered to give him everything that she had, so to place him in the world that opposition would be more pleasant to him than office, to supply every want, and had done so in a manner that had gratified all his vanity. But he had refused it all, because he was bound to the girl at Floodborough. My readers will probably say that he was not a true man unless he could do this without a regret. When Phineas thought of it at all, there were many regrets. But there was at the same time a resolve on his part that if any man had ever loved the girl he promised to love, he would love Mary Flood Jones. 1,000 times he had told himself she had not the spirit of Lady Laura, or the bright wit of Violet Effingham, or the beauty of Madame Goesler. But Mary had charms of her own that were more valuable than them all. Was there one among the three who had trusted him as she trusted him, or loved him with the same satisfied devotion? There were regrets that were heavy on his heart, for London and Parliament and the clubs and Downing Street had become dear to him. He liked to think of himself as he rode in the park, and was greeted by all those whose greeting was the most worth having. There were regrets, sad regrets. But the girl whom he loved better than the parks and the clubs, better even than Westminster and Downing Street, should never know that they had existed. These thoughts were running through his mind even while he was listening to Mr. Monk, as he propounded his theory of doing justice to Ireland. This might probably be the last great debate in which Phineas would be able to take a part, and he was determined that he would do his best in it. He did not intend to speak on this day, if, as was generally supposed, the House would be adjourned before a division could be obtained, but he would remain on the alert and see how the thing went. He had come to understand the forms of the place, and was as well trained a young member of Parliament as any there. He had been quick at learning a lesson that is not easily learned, and knew how things were going, and what were the proper moments for this question or that form of motion. He could anticipate a count-out, understood the tone of men's minds, and could read the gestures of the House. It was very little likely that the debate should be over tonight. He knew that, and as the present time was the evening of Tuesday, he resolved at once that he would speak as early as he could on the following Thursday. What a pity it was that with one who had learned so much, all his learning should be in vain. At about 2 o'clock he himself succeeded in moving the adjournment of the debate. This he did from a seat below the gangway to which he had removed himself from the Treasury bench. Then the House was up, and he walked home with Mr. Monk. Mr. Monk, since he had been told positively by Phineas that he had resolved upon resigning his office, had said nothing more of his sorrow at his friend's resolve, but had used him as one political friend uses another, telling him all his thoughts and all his hopes as to this new measure of his, and taking counsel with him as to the way in which the fight should be fought. Together they had counted over the list of members, marking these men as supporters, those as opponents, and another set, now more important than either, as being doubtful. From day to day, those who had been written down as doubtful were struck off that third list and put in either the one or the other of those who were either supporters or opponents. And their different modes of argument were settled between these two allied orators, how one should take this line and the other that. To Mr. Monk this was very pleasant. He was quite assured now that opposition was more congenial to his spirit and more fitting for him than office. There was no doubt to him as to his future sitting in Parliament, let the result of this contest be what it might. The work which he was now doing was the work for which he had been training himself all his life. While he had been forced to attend cabinet councils from week to week, he had been depressed. Now he was exultant. Phineas, seeing and understanding all this, said but little to his friend of his own prospects. As long as this pleasant battle was raging, he could fight in it shoulder to shoulder with the man he loved. After that, there would be a blank. "I do not see how we are to fail to have a majority after Daubeny's speech tonight," said Mr. Monk, as they walked together down Parliament Street through the bright moonlight. "He expressly said that he only spoke for himself," said Phineas. "But we know what that means. He's bidding for office, and of course those who want office with him will vote as he votes. We have already counted those who would go into office, but they will not carry the whole party." "It'll carry enough of them." "There are 40 or 50 men on his side of the House, and as many perhaps on ours," said Mr. Monk, "who have no idea of any kind on any bill, and who simply follow the bell whether into this lobby or that. Argument never touches them. They do not even look to the result of a division on their own interests, as the making of any calculation would be laborious to them. Their party leader is to them a pope whom they do not dream of doubting. I never can quite make up my mind whether it is good or bad that there should be such men in Parliament." "Men who think much want to speak often," said Phineas. "Exactly so. And as speaking members, God knows that we have enough. And I suppose that these purblind sheep do have some occult weight that is salutary. They enable a leader to be a leader, and even in that way they are useful. We shall get a division on Thursday. I understand that Gresham has consented to that. So Rattler told me. Palliser is to speak, and Barrington Erle. And they say that Robson is going to make an onslaught, especially on me. We shall get it over by 1 o'clock. "And if we beat them?" asked Phineas. "It'll depend on the numbers. Everybody who has spoken to me about it seems to think that they will dissolve if there be a respectable majority against them." "Of course he will resolve," said Phineas, speaking of Mr. Gresham. "What else can he do?" "He is very anxious to carry his Irish Reform Bill first, if he can do so. Good night, Phineas. I shall not be down tomorrow, as there's nothing to be done. Come to me on Thursday, and we'll go to the House together." On the Wednesday, Phineas was engaged to dine with Mr. Lowe. There was a dinner party in Bedford Square, and Phineas met half a dozen barristers and their wives, men to whom he had looked up as successful pundits in the law some 5 or 6 years ago, but who since that time had almost learned to look up to him. And now they treated him with that courteousness of manner which success in life always begets. There was a judge there who was very civil to him, and the judge's wife, whom he had taken down to dinner, was very gracious to him. The judge had got his prize in life, and was therefore personally indifferent to the fate of ministers. But the judge's wife had a brother who wanted a county court from Lord de Terrier, and it was known that Phineas was given valuable assistance towards the attainment of this subject. "I do think that you and Mr. Monk are so right," said the judge's wife. Phineas, who understood how it came to pass that the judge's wife should be so cordially approve his conduct, could not help thinking how grand a thing it would be for him to have a county court for himself. When the guests were gone, he was left alone with Mr. and Mrs. Lowe, and remained a while with them, there having been an understanding that they should have a last chat together over the affairs of our hero. "Do you really mean that you will not stand again?" asked Mrs. Lowe. "I do mean it. I may say that I cannot do so. My father is hardly so well able to help me as he was when I began this game, and I shall certainly not ask him for money to support a canvass." "It's 1,000 pities," said Mrs. Lowe. "I really had begun to think that you would make it answer," said Mr. Lowe. "In one way I have made it answer. For the last 3 years I have lived upon what I have earned, and I am not in debt. But now I must begin the world again. I am afraid I shall find the drudgery very hard." "It is hard, no doubt," said the barrister, who had gone through it all and was now reaping the fruits of it. "But I suppose you have not forgotten what you learned." "Who can say? I dare say I have, but I do not mean the drudgery of learning so much as the drudgery of looking after work, of expecting briefs which perhaps will never come. I am 30 years old now, you know." "Are you indeed?" said Mrs. Lowe, who knew his age to a day. "How the time passes! I'm sure I hope you'll get on, Mr. Finn. I do indeed." "I'm sure he will if he puts his shoulder to it," said Mr. Lowe. Neither the lawyer nor his wife repeated any of those sententious admonitions which had almost become rebukes, and which had been so common in their mouths. The fall with which they had threatened Phineas Finn had come upon him, and they were too generous to remind him of their wisdom and sagacity. Indeed, when he got up to take his leave, Mrs. Lowe, who probably might not see him again for years, was quite affectionate in her manners to him, and looked as if she were almost minded to kiss him as she pressed his hand. "We will come and see you," she said, "when you are master of the rolls in Dublin." "We shall see him before then, thundering at us poor Tories in the House," said Mr. Lowe. "He will be back again sooner or later." And so they parted. End of chapter 74. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 75 of Phineas Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 75. PPC. On the Thursday morning before Phineas went to Mr. Monk, a gentleman called upon him at his lodgings. Phineas requested the servant to bring up the gentleman's name, but tempted perhaps by a shilling, the girl brought up the gentleman instead. It was Mr. Quintus Slide, from the office of the Banner of the People. "Mr. Finn," said Quintus, with his hand extended, "I have come to offer you the calumet of peace." Phineas certainly desired no such calumet, but to refuse a man's hand is to declare active war after a fashion which men do not like to adopt except on deliberation. He had never cared a straw for the abuse which Mr. Slide had poured upon him, and now he gave his hand to the man of letters. But he did not sit down, nor did he offer a seat to Mr. Slide. I know that as a man of sense who knows the world, you will accept the calumet of peace, continued Mr. Slide. I don't know why I should be asked particularly to accept war or peace, said Phineas. Well, Mr. Finn, I don't often quote the Bible, but those who are not for us must be against us. You will agree to that. Now that you've freed yourself from the iniquities of that sink of abomination in Downing Street, I look upon you as a man again. Upon my word, you are very kind. As a man and also a brother. I suppose you know that I've got the banner into my own hands now. Phineas was obliged to explain that he had not hitherto been made acquainted with this great literary and political secret. Oh dear, yes, altogether so. We've got rid of old Rusty, as I used to call him. He wouldn't go the pace, and so we stripped him. He's doing the West of England Art Journal now, and he hangs out down at Bristol. I hope he'll succeed, Mr. Slide. He'll earn his wages. He's a man who will always earn his wages, but nothing more. Well now, Mr. Finn, I will just offer you one word of apology for our little severities. Pray do nothing of the kind. Indeed I shall. Duty is duty. There were some things printed which were a little rough, but if one isn't a little rough, there ain't no flavour. Of course I wrote 'em. You know my hand, I dare say. I only remember that there was some throwing of mud. Just so. But mud don't break any bones, does it? When you turned against us, I had to be down on you, and I was down upon you. That's just about all of it. Now you're coming among us again, and so I come to you with a calumet of peace. But I am not coming among you. Yes, you are, Finn, and bringing Monk with you. It was now becoming very disagreeable, and Phineas was beginning to perceive that it would soon be his turn to say something rough. Now, I'll tell you what my proposition is. If you'll do us 2 leaders a week through the session, you shall have a cheque for £16 on the last day of every month. If that's not honester money than what you got in Downing Street, my name is not Quintus Slide. Mr. Slide, said Phineas, and then he paused. If we are to come to business, drop the mister. It makes things go so much easier. We are not to come to business, and I do not want things to go easy. I believe you said some things of me in your newspaper that were very scurrilous. What of that? If you mind that sort of thing, I did not regard it in the least. You are quite welcome to continue it. I don't doubt but you will continue it, but you are not welcome to come here afterwards. Do you mean to turn me out? Just that. You printed a heap of lies. Lies, Mr. Finn? Did you say lies, sir? I said lies, lies, lies. And Phineas walked over at him as though he were going to pitch him instantly out of the window. You may go and write as many more as you like. It is your trade, and you must do it or starve, but do not come to me again. Then he opened the door and stood with it in his hand. Very well, sir. I shall know how to punish this. Exactly. But if you please, you'll go and do your punishment at the office of the Banner, unless you'd like to try it here. You want to kick me and spit at me, but you will prefer to do it in print. Yes, sir, said Quintus Slide. I shall prefer to do it in print, though I must own that the temptation to adopt the manual violence of a ruffian is great, very great indeed. But he resisted the temptation, and walked down the stairs, concocting his article as he went. Mr. Quintus Slide did not so much impede the business of his day, but what Phineas was with Mr. Monk by 2, and at his place in the house when prayers were read at 4. As he sat in his place, conscious of the work that was before him, listening to the presentation of petitions, and to the formal reading of certain notices of motions, which with the asking of sundry questions occupied over half an hour, he looked back and remembered accurately his own feelings on a certain night on which he intended to get up and address the House. The ordeal before him had then been so terrible that it had almost obliterated for the moment his sense of hearing and of sight. He had hardly been able to perceive what had been going on around him, and had vainly endeavoured to occupy himself in recalling to his memory the words which he wished to pronounce. When the time for pronouncing them had come, he had found himself unable to stand upon his legs. He smiled as he recalled all this in his memory, waiting impatiently for the moment in which he might rise. His audience was assured to him now, and he did not fear it. His opportunity for utterance was his own, and even the speaker could not deprive him of it. During these minutes he thought not at all of the words that he was to say. He had prepared his matter, but had prepared no words. He knew that words would come readily enough to him, and that he had learned the task of turning his thoughts quickly into language while standing with a crowd of listeners around him, as a practised writer does when seated in his chair. There was no violent beating at his heart now, no dimness of the eyes, no feeling that the ground was turning round under his feet. If only those weary, vain questions would get themselves all asked, so that he might rise and begin the work of the night. Then there came the last thought as the house was hushed for his rising. What was the good of it all, when he would never have an opportunity of speaking there again? But not on that account would he be slack in his endeavour now. He would be listened to once at least, not as a subaltern of the government, but as the owner of a voice prominent in opposition to the government. He had been taught by Mr. Monk that this was the one place in the House in which a man with the power of speaking could really enjoy pleasure without alloy. He would make the trial, once, if never again. Things had so gone with him that the rostrum was his own, and a house crammed to overflowing was there to listen to him. He had given up his place in order that he might be able to speak his mind, and had become aware that many intended to listen to him while he spoke. He had observed that the rows of strangers were thick in the galleries, that peers were standing in the passages, and that over the reporter's head the ribbons of many ladies would be seen through the bars of their cage. Yes, for this once he would have an audience. He spoke for about an hour, and while he was speaking he knew nothing about himself, whether he was doing it well or ill. Something of himself he did say soon after he had commenced, not quite beginning with it, as though his mind had been laden with the matter. He had, he said, found himself compelled to renounce his happy allegiance to the First Lord of the Treasury, and to quit the pleasant company in which, humble as had been his place, he had been allowed to sit and act, by his unfortunate conviction in this great subject. He had been told, he said, that it was a misfortune in itself for one so young as he to have convictions. But his Irish birth and Irish connection had brought this misfortune of his country so closely home to him that he found the task of extricating himself from it to be impossible. Of what further, he said, speaking on that terribly unintelligible subject, a tenant right proposed for Irish farmers, no English reader will desire to know much. Irish subjects in the House of Commons are interesting or are dull, are debated before a crowded audience composed of all who are leaders in the great world of London, or before empty benches, in accordance with the importance of the moment and the character of the debate. For us now it is enough to know that to our hero was accorded that attention which orators love, which will almost make an orator if it can be assured. A full house with a promise of big type on the next morning would wake to eloquence the propounder of a Canadian grievance or the mover of an Indian budget. Phineas did not stir out of the house till the division was over, having agreed with Mr. Monk that they two would remain through it all and hear everything that was to be said. Mr. Gresham had already spoken, and to Mr. Palliser was confided the task of winding up the argument for the government. Mr. Robson spoke also, greatly enlivening the tedium of the evening, and to Mr. Monk was permitted the privilege of a final reply. At 2 o'clock the division came, and the ministry were beaten by a majority of 23. "And now," said Mr. Monk, as he again walked home with Phineas, "the pity is that we are not a bit nearer tenant right than we were before." "But we are nearer to it." "In one sense, yes. Such a debate and such a majority will make men think. But no, think is too high a word. As a rule, men don't think. But it will make them believe that there is something in it. Many who before regarded legislation on the subject as chimerical will now fancy that it is only dangerous, or perhaps not more than difficult, and so in time it will come to be looked on as among the things possible, then among the things probable, and so at last it will be ranged in the list of those few measures which the country requires as being absolutely needed. That is the way in which public opinion is made." "It is no loss of time," said Phineas, "to have taken the first great step in making it." "The first great step was taken long ago," said Mr. Monk, "taken by men who were looked upon as revolutionary demagogues, almost as traitors, because they took it. But it is a great thing to take any step that leads us onwards." 2 days after this, Mr. Gresham declared his intention of dissolving the House because of the adverse division which had been produced by Mr. Monks's motion, but expressed a wish to be allowed to carry an Irish Reform Bill through Parliament before he did so. He explained how expedient this would be, but declared at the same time that if any strong opposition were made, he would abandon the project. His intention simply was to pass with regard to Ireland a measure which must be passed soon, and which ought to be passed before a new election took place. The bill was ready, and should be read for the first time on the next night, if the House were willing. The House was willing, though with a very many recalcitrant Irish members. The Irish members made loud opposition, and then twitted Mr. Gresham with his promise that he would not go on with his bill if opposition were made. But nevertheless he did go on, and the measure was hurried through the two Houses in a week. Our hero, who still sat for Loughshane, but who was never to sit for Loughshane again, gave what assistance he could to the government, and voted for the measure which deprived Loughshane for ever of its parliamentary honours. "And very dirty conduct, I think it was," said Lord Tulla, when he discussed the subject with his agent. "After being put in for the borough twice, almost free of expense, it was very dirty." It never occurred to Lord Tulla that a member of Parliament might feel himself obliged to vote on such a subject in accordance with his judgment. The Irish Reform Bill was scrambled through the two Houses, and then the session was over. The session was over, and they who knew anything of the private concerns of Mr. Phineas Finn were aware that he was about to return to Ireland, and did not intend to reappear on the scene which had known him so well for the last 5 years. "I cannot tell you how sad it makes me," said Mr. Monk. "And it makes me sad too," said Phineas. "I try to shake off the melancholy, and tell myself from day to day that it is unmanly, but it gets the better of me just at present." "I feel quite certain that you will come back among us again," said Mr. Monk. "Everybody tells me so, and yet I feel quite certain that I shall never come back with a seat in Parliament. As my old tutor, Lowe, has told me scores of times, I began at the wrong end. Here I am, 30 years of age, and I have not a shilling in the world, and I do not know how to earn one." "Only for me you would still be receiving ever so much a year, and all would be pleasant," said Mr. Monk. "But how long would it have lasted? The first moment that Daubeny got the upper hand, I should have fallen lower than I have fallen now. If not this year, it would have been the next. My only comfort is in this, that I have done the thing myself, and have not been turned out." To the very last, however, Mr. Monk continued to express his opinion that Phineas would come back, declaring that he had known no instance of a young man who had made himself useful in Parliament, and then had been allowed to leave it in early life. Among those of whom he was bound to take a special leave, the members of the family of Lord Brentford were of course the foremost. He had already heard of the reconciliation of Miss Effingham and Lord Chiltern, and was anxious to offer his congratulation to both of them. And it was essential to him that he should see Lady Laura. To her he wrote a line, saying how much he hoped that he should be able to bid her adieu, and a time was fixed for his coming at which she knew that she wouldn't meet him alone. But, as chance ruled it, he came upon the two lovers together, and then remembered that he had hardly ever before been in the same room with both of them at the same time. "Oh, Mr. Finn, what a beautiful speech you made! I read every word of it," said Violet. "And I didn't even look at it, old fellow," said Chiltern, getting up and putting his arm on the other's shoulder in a way that was common with him when he was quite intimate with the friend near him. "Laura went down and heard it," said Violet. "I could not do that because I was tied to my aunt. You can't conceive how dutiful I am during this last month." "And is it to be in a month, Chiltern?" said Phineas. "Oh, she says so. She arranges everything, in concert with my father. When I threw up the sponge, I simply asked for a long day. 'A long day, my lord,' I said. But my father and Violet between them refused me any mercy." "You do not believe him," said Violet. "Not a word. If I did, he would want to see me on the coast of Flanders again, I don't doubt. I've come to congratulate you both." "Thank you, Mr. Finn," said Violet, taking his hand with hearty kindness. "I should not have been quite happy without one nice word from you." "I'll try and make the best of it," said Chiltern. "But I say, you'll come over and ride Bonebreaker again. He's down there at the Bull, and I've taken a little blocks close by. I can't stand the governor's county for hunting." "And will your wife go down to Willingford?" "Oh, of course she will, and ride hounds a great deal closer than I can ever do. Mind you come. If there is anything in the stable fit to carry you, you shall have it." Then Phineas had to explain that he had come to bid them farewell, and that it was not at all probable that he would ever be able to see Willingford again in the hunting season. "I don't suppose that I shall make either of you quite understand it, but I have got to begin again. The chances are that I shall never see another foxhound all my life." "Not in Ireland?" exclaimed Lord Chiltern. "Not unless I should have to examine one as a witness. I have nothing before me but downright hard work, and a great deal of that must be done before I can hope to earn a shilling." "But you are so clever," said Violet. "Of course it'll come quickly." "I do not mean to be impatient about it, nor yet unhappy," said Phineas. "Only hunting won't be much in my line." "And will you leave London altogether?" Violet asked. "Altogether. I shall stick to one club, Brooks's, but I shall take my name off all the others." "What a deuce of a nuisance," said Lord Chiltern. "I have no doubt you'll be very happy," said Violet, "and you'll be a Lord Chancellor in no time. But you won't go quite yet." "Next Sunday." "You will return. You must be here for our wedding. Indeed you must. I will not be married unless you do." Even this, however, was impossible. He must go on Sunday, and must return no more. Then he made his little farewell speech, which he could not deliver without some awkward stuttering. He would think of her on the day of her marriage, and pray that she might be happy, and he would send her a little trifle before he went, which he hoped she would wear in remembrance of their old friendship. "She shall wear it, whatever it is, or I'll know the reason why," said Chiltern. "Hold your tongue, you rough bear," said Violet. "Of course I'll wear it, and of course I'll think of the giver. I shall have many presents, but few that I will think of so much." Then Phineas left the room with his throat so full that he could not speak another word. "He's still broken-hearted about you," said the favoured lover, as soon as his rival had left the room. "It is not that," said Violet. "He's broken-hearted about everything. The whole world is vanishing away from him. I wish he could have made up his mind to marry that German woman with all the money." It must be understood, however, that Phineas had never spoken a word to anyone as to the offer which the German woman had made to him. It was on the morning of the Sunday on which he was to leave London that he saw Lady Laura. He had asked that it might be so, in order that he might then have nothing more upon his mind. He found her quite alone, and he could see by her eyes that she had been weeping. As he looked at her, remembering that it was not yet 6 years since he had first been allowed to enter that room, he could not but perceive how very much she was altered in appearance. Then she had been 23, and had not looked to be a day older. Now she might have been taken to be nearer 40. So much had her troubles preyed upon her spirit, and eaten into the vitality of her youth. "So you have come to say good-bye?" she said, smiling as she rose to meet him. "Yes, Lady Laura, to say good-bye. Not for ever, I hope, but probably for long." "No, not for ever. At any rate, we will not think so." Then she paused, but he was silent, sitting with his hat dangling in his 2 hands, and his eyes fixed upon the floor. "Do you know, Mr. Finn," she continued, "that sometimes I am very angry with myself about you?" "Then it must be because you have been too kind to me." "It is because I fear that I have done much to injure you. From the first day that I knew you, do you remember when we were talking here in this very room about the beginning of the Reform Bill? From that day I wished that you should come among us and be one of us." "I have been with you to my infinite satisfaction, while it lasted." "But it has not lasted, and now I fear that it has done you harm." "Who can say whether it has been for good or evil? But of this I am sure, you will be certain, that I am very grateful to you for all the goodness you have shown me." Then again he was silent. She did not know what it was that she wanted, but she did desire some expression from his lips that should be warmer than an expression of gratitude. An expression of love, of existing love, she would have felt to be an insult, and would have treated it as such. Indeed, she knew that from him no such insult could come. but she was in that morbid, melancholy state of mind which requires the excitement of more than ordinary sympathy, even though that sympathy be all painful. And I think that she would have been pleased had he referred to the passion for herself which he had once expressed. If he would have spoken of his love and of her mistake, and have made some half-suggestion as to what might have been their lives had things gone differently, though she would have rebuked him even for that, still it would have comforted her. But at this moment, though he remembered much that had passed between them, he was not even thinking of the braes of Linter. All that had taken place 4 years ago, and there had been so many other things since which had moved him even more than that. "You have heard what I have arranged for myself?" she said at last. "Your father has told me that you are going to Dresden." "Yes, he will accompany me, coming home, of course, for Parliament. It is a sad break-up, is it not? But the lawyer says that if I remain here, I may be subject to very disagreeable attempts from Mr. Kennedy to force me to go back again. It is odd, is it not, that he should not understand how impossible it is?" "He means to do his duty." "I believe so. But he becomes more stern every day to those who are with him. And then, why should I remain here? What is there to tempt me? As a woman separated from her husband, I cannot take an interest in those things which used to charm me. I feel that I am crushed and quelled by my position, even though there is no disgrace in it." "Oh, no disgrace, certainly," said Phineas. "But I am nobody, or worse than nobody." "And I also am going to be a nobody," said Phineas, laughing. "Ah, you are a man and will get over it, and you have many years before you will begin to be growing old." "I am growing old already. Yes, I am. I feel it, and know it, and see it. A woman has a fine game to play, but then she is so easily bowled out, and the term allowed to her is so short." "A man's allowance of time may be short too," said Phineas. "But he can try his hand again." Then there was another pause. "I had thought, Mr. Finn, that you would have married," she said in her very lowest voice. "You knew all my hopes and fears about that." "I mean that you would have married Madame Goesler." "What made you think that, Lady Laura?" "Because I saw that she liked you, because such a marriage would have been so suitable. She has all that you want. You know what they say of her now?" "What do they say?" "That the Duke of Omnium offered to make her his wife, and that she refused him, for your sake." "Well, there's nothing that people won't say, nothing on earth," said Phineas. Then he got up and took his leave of her. He also wanted to part from her with some special expression of affection, but he did not know how to choose his words. He had wished that some allusion should be made, not to the braes of Linter, but to the close confidence which had so long existed between them. But he found that the language to do this properly was wanting to him. Had the opportunity arisen, he would have told her now the whole story of Mary Flood Jones. But the opportunity did not come, and he left her, never having mentioned the name of his Mary, or having hinted at his engagement to any one of his friends in London. "It is better so," he said to himself. "My life in Ireland is to be a new life, and why should I mix two things together that will be so different?" He was to dine at his lodgings, and then leave them for good at 8 o'clock. He packed up everything before he went to Portman Square, and he returned home only just in time to sit down to his solitary mutton chop. But as he sat down he saw a small note addressed to himself lying on the table among the crowd of books, letters, and papers of which he had still to make disposal. It was a very small note in an envelope of a peculiar tint of pink, and he knew the handwriting well. The blood mounted all over his face as he took it up, and he hesitated for a moment before he opened it. It could not be that the offer should be repeated to him. Slowly, hardly venturing at first to look at the enclosure, he opened it, and the words which it contained were as follows: "I learn that you are going today, and I write a word which you will receive just as you are departing. It is to say merely this, that when I left you the other day I was angry, not with you, but with myself. let me wish you all good wishes and that prosperity which I know you will deserve, and which I think you will win. Yours very truly, M.M.G. Sunday morning. Should he put off his journey and go to her this very evening and claim her as his friend? The question was asked and answered in a moment. Of course he would not go to her. Were he to do so, there would be only one possible word for him to say, and that word should certainly never be spoken. But he wrote to her a reply, shorter even than her own short note. Thanks, dear friend. I do not doubt but that you and I understand each other thoroughly, and that each trusts the other for good wishes and honest intentions. Always yours, P.F. I write these as I am starting. When he had written this, he kept it till the last moment in his hand, thinking that he would not send it. But as he slipped into the cab, he gave the note to his late landlady to post. At the station, Bunce came to him to say a note of farewell, not a note of, a word of. At the station, Bunce came to him to say a word of farewell, and Mrs. Bunce was on his arm. "Well done, Mr. Finn, well done," said Bunce. "I always knew there was a good drop in you." "You always told me I should ruin myself in Parliament, and so I have," said Phineas. "Not at all. It takes a good deal to ruin a man if he's got the right spirit. I've better hopes of you now than ever I had in the old days when you used to be looking out for Government place. And Mr. Monk has tried that too. I thought he would find the iron too heavy for him." "God bless you, Mr. Finn," said Mrs. Bunce, with her handkerchief up to her eyes. "There's not one of 'em I ever had as lodgers I've cared about half as much as I did for you." Then they shook hands with him through the window, and the train was off. End of chapter 75. Recording by Simon Evers.
Chapter 76 of Phineas Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paradise Camouflage. Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 76. Conclusion. We are told that it is a bitter moment with the Lord Mayor when he leaves the Mansion House and becomes once more Alderman Jones of number 75 Bucklersby. Lord Chancellors going out of office have a great fall, though they take pensions with them for their consolation. And the President of the United States, when he leaves the glory of the White House and once more becomes a simple citizen, must feel the change severely. But our hero, Phineas Finn, as he turned his back upon the scene of his many successes and prepared himself for permanent residence in his own country, was, I think, in a worse plight than any of the reduced divinities to whom I have alluded. They, at any rate, had known that their fall would come. He, like Icarus, had flown up towards the sun, hoping that his wings of wax would bear him steadily aloft among the gods. Seeing that his wings were wings of wax, we must acknowledge that they were very good, but the celestial lights had been too strong for them. And now, having lived for 5 years with lords and countesses, with ministers and orators, with beautiful women and men of fashion, he must start again in a little lodging in Dublin, and hope that the attorneys of that litigious city might be good to him. On his journey home he made but one resolution. He would make the change, or attempt to make it, with manly strength. During his last month in London he had allowed himself to be sad, depressed, and melancholy. There should be an end of all that now. Nobody at home should see that he was depressed, and Mary, his own Mary, should at any rate have no cause to think that her love and his own engagement had ever been the cause to him of depression. Did he not value her love more than anything in the world? 1,000 times he told himself that he did. She was there in the old house of Killaloe to greet him. her engagement was an affair known to all the county, and she had no idea that it would become her to be coy in her love. She was in his arms before he had spoken to his father and mother, and had made her little speech to him, very inaudibly indeed, while he was covering her sweet face with kisses.
"Oh, Phineas, I am so proud of you, and I think you are so right, and I am so glad you have done it."
Again he covered her face with kisses. Could he ever have had such satisfaction as this, had he allowed Madame Goesler's hand to remain in his? On the first night of his arrival he sat for an hour downstairs, with his father talking over his plans. He could not but feel, that he was not the hero now that he had been when he was last at Killaloe, when he had come thither with a cabinet minister under his wing, and yet his father did his best to prevent the growth of any such feeling. The old doctor was not quite as well off as he had been when Phineas first started with his high hopes for London. Since that day he had abandoned his profession, and was now living on the fruits of his life's labour. For the last 2 years he had been absolved from the necessity of providing an income for his son, and had probably allowed himself to feel that no such demand upon him would again be made. Now, however, it was necessary that he should do so. Could his son manage to live on 200 a year? There would then be 400 a year left for the wants of the family at home. Phineas swore that he could fight his battle on 150, and they ended the argument by splitting the difference. He had been paying exactly the same sum of money for the rooms he had just left in London, but then, when he left those rooms, his income had been 2,000 a year. Tenant right was a very fine thing, but could it be worth such a fall as this? "And about dear Mary?" said the father. "I hope it may not be very long," said Phineas. "I have not spoken to her about it, but your mother says that Mrs. Flood-Jones is very averse to a long engagement." "What can I do? She would not wish me to marry her daughter with no other income than allowance made by you." "Your mother says that she has some idea that you and she might live together, that if they let Floodborough you might take a small house in Dublin. Remember, Phineas, I am not proposing it myself." Then Phineas bethought himself that he was not even yet so low in the world that he need submit himself to terms dictated to him by Mrs. Flood-Jones. "I am glad that you do not propose it, sir." "Why so, Phineas?" "Because I should have been obliged to oppose the plan, even if it had come from you. Mother-in-laws are never a comfort in a house." "I never tried it myself," said the doctor, "and I will never try it. I am quite sure that Mary does not expect any such thing, and that she is willing to wait. If I can shorten the term of waiting by hard work, I will do so." The decision to which Phineas had come on this matter was probably made known to Mrs. Flood-Jones after some mild fashion by old Mrs. Finn. Nothing more was said to Phineas about a joint household, but he was quite able to perceive from the manner of the lady towards him that his proposed mother-in-law wished him to understand that he was treating her daughter very badly. What did it signify? None of them knew the story of Madame Goesler, and of course none of them would know it. None of them would ever hear how well he had behaved to his little Mary. But Mary did know it all before he left her to go up to London. The two lovers allowed themselves, or were allowed by their elders, 1 week of exquisite bliss together, and during this week Phineas told her, I think, everything. He told her everything as far as he could do so without seeming to boast of his own successes. How is a man not to tell such tales when he has on his arm, close to him, a girl who tells him her little everything of life, and only asks for his confidence in return? And then his secrets are so precious to her, and so sacred, that he feels as sure of her fidelity as though she were a very goddess of faith and trust. And the temptation to tell is so great. For all that he has to tell, she loves him the better, and still the better. A man desires to win a virgin heart, and is happy to know, or at least to believe, that he has won it. With a woman, every former rival is an added victim to the wheels of the triumphant chariot in which she is sitting.
All these has he known and loved, culling sweets from each of them. But now he has come to me, and I am the sweetest of them all.
And so Mary was taught to believe of Laura, and of Violet, and of Madame Goesler, that though they had charms to please, his lover had never been so charmed as he was now while she was hanging to his breast. And I think that she was right in her belief. During those lovely summer evening walks along the shores of Loughshane, Phineas was as happy as he had ever been at any moment of his life.
I shall never be impatient, never,
she said to him on the last evening.
All I want is that you should write to me.
I shall want more than that, Mary.
Then you must come down and see me. When you do come, they will be happy, happy days for me. But of course, we cannot be married for the next 20 years.
Say 40, Mary.
I will say anything that you like. You will know what I mean just as well. And Phineas, I must tell you one thing, though it makes me sad to think of it, and will make me sad to speak of it.
I will not have you sad on our last night, Mary.
I must say it. I am beginning to understand how much you have given up for me.
I have given up nothing for you.
If I had not been at Killaloe when Mr. Monk was there, and if we had not, oh dear, if I had not loved you so very much, you might have remained in London, and that lady would have been your wife.
Never, said Phineas, stoutly.
Would she not? She must not be your wife now, Phineas. I'm not going to pretend that I will give you up.
That is unkind, Mary.
Oh, well, you may say what you please. If that is unkind, I am unkind. It would kill me to lose you.
Had he done right? How could there be a doubt about it? How could there be a question about it? Which of them had loved him, or was capable of loving him as Mary loved him? What girl was ever so sweet, so gracious, so angelic as his own Mary? He swore to her that he was prouder of winning her than of anything he had ever done in all his life, and that of all the treasures that had ever come in his way, she was the most precious. She went to bed that night the happiest girl in all Connacht, although when she parted from him she understood that she was not to see him again till Christmas Eve. But she did see him again before the summer was over, and the manner of their meeting was in this wise. Immediately after the passing of that scrambled Irish Reform Bill, Parliament, as the reader knows, was dissolved. This was in the early days of June, and before the end of July the new members were again assembled in Westminster. This session, late in summer, was very terrible, but it was not very long, and then it was essentially necessary. There was something of the year's business which must yet be done, and the country would require to know who were to be the ministers of the government. It is not needed that the reader should be troubled any further with the strategy of one political leader or of another, or that more should be said of Mr. Monk and his tenant right. The House of Commons had offended Mr. Gresham by voting in a majority against him, and Mr. Gresham had punished the House of Commons by subjecting it to the expense and nuisance of a new election. All this is constitutional and rational enough to Englishmen, though it may be unintelligible to strangers. The upshot on the present occasion was that the ministers remained in their places, and that Mr. Monk's bill, though it had received the substantial honour of a second reading, passed away for the present into the limbo of abortive legislation. All this would not concern us at all, not our poor hero much, were it not that the great men with whom he had been for 2 years so pleasant a colleague remembered him with something of affectionate regret. Whether it began with Mr. Gresham or with Lord Cantrip, I will not say, or whether Mr. Monk, though now a political enemy, may have said a word that brought about the good deed. Be that as it may, just before the summer session was brought to a close, Phineas received the following letter from Lord Cantrip. Downing Street, August the 1st, 1860 something. My dear Mr. Finn, Mr. Gresham has been talking to me, and we both think that possibly a permanent government appointment may be acceptable to you. We have no doubt that, should this be the case, your services would be very valuable to the country. There is a vacancy for a poor law inspector at present in Ireland, whose residence I believe should be in Cork. The salary is 1,000 a year. Should the appointment suit you, Mr. Gresham will be most happy to nominate you to the office. Let me have a line at your early convenience. Believe me, most sincerely yours, Cantrip. He received the letter one morning in Dublin, and within 3 hours he was on his route to Killaloe. Of course he would accept the appointment, but he would not even do that without telling Mary of his new prospect. Of course he would accept the appointment. Though he had been as yet barely 2 months in Dublin, though he had hardly been long enough settled to his work to have hoped to be able to see in which way there might be a vista open leading to success, still he had fancied that he had seen that success was impossible. He didn't know how to begin, and men were afraid of him, thinking that he was unsteady, arrogant, and prone to failure. He had not seen his way to the possibility of a guinea.
1,000 a year?
Said Mary Flood Jones, opening her eyes wide with wonder at the golden future before them. It is nothing very great for a perpetuity, said Phineas.
Oh, Phineas, surely 1,000 a year will be very nice.
It'll be certain, said Phineas, and then we can be married tomorrow.
But I have been making up my mind to wait ever so long,
said Mary. Then your mind must be unmade, said Phineas. What was the nature of the reply to Lord Cantrip the reader may imagine, and thus we will leave our hero an inspector of poor houses in the county of Cork. End of Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Andy from Inverarnon. MELYS.WS